Number 1, the Golden State Killer, a decades-long reign of terror that shook the entire state of California to its core. For more than 4 decades, the identity of one of the most prolific and terrifying criminals in American history remained one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in the annals of law enforcement. He was known by many names over the years: the Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, the original Night Stalker, but it was the name Golden State Killer, coined by true crime writer Michelle McNamara in her relentless pursuit of justice, that ultimately became synonymous with the faceless monster who had terrorized entire communities across California for more than a decade. His crimes were not limited to a single category of horror. He burglarized homes with the casual confidence of someone who knew he would never be caught. He raped women in their own beds while their husbands and boyfriends lay bound and helpless just feet away. He murdered couples in their homes, leaving behind nothing but shell casings, ligature marks, and a trail of psychological devastation that would follow survivors for the rest of their lives. And then, as suddenly and inexplicably as he had appeared, he vanished, leaving behind more than 50 rape victims, 13 murder victims, and hundreds of investigators who spent the better part of their careers trying to unmask him. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo Jr., and for 44 years, he lived as a free man, a former police officer, a grandfather, a neighbor who waved from his driveway and complained about noise, while the weight of his crimes pressed down on every victim, every investigator, and every family member who had never stopped searching for answers. The story of how he was finally caught is as remarkable as it is chilling, and it begins not in the shadows of the crimes themselves, but in the quiet, unassuming suburbs of Sacramento, California, where a young man with a violent inner world was slowly taking shape long before anyone realized the danger he posed. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. was born on November 8, 1945, in Bath, New York, the son of Joseph James DeAngelo Sr., a United States Army Staff Sergeant, and his wife, Kathleen. His early childhood was marked by instability and trauma that would, in retrospect, seem almost prophetic given the darkness that would define his adult life. When DeAngelo was a young child, he witnessed his younger sister being sexually assaulted by 2 older boys, an experience that investigators and psychologists would later point to as a defining moment in his psychological development. His family moved frequently due to his father's military assignments, eventually settling in various parts of California, and DeAngelo himself served in the United States Navy during the Vietnam era, an experience that gave him discipline, tactical knowledge, and an intimate familiarity with the kind of methodical planning that would later become his criminal signature. After his military service, DeAngelo enrolled at Sacramento State University, where he studied criminal justice, a detail that, in hindsight, carries a deeply sinister irony. He graduated with a degree in criminal justice and joined the Exeter Police Department in Tulare County, California, in 1973, becoming a sworn law enforcement officer with a badge, a gun, and access to the very investigative systems that would one day be used to hunt him. His colleagues described him as competent, professional, and unremarkable. A man who did his job, followed procedures, and gave no outward indication of the predator lurking beneath the surface. He was engaged to a woman named Bonnie Jean Caldwell during this period, a relationship that seemed to anchor him in normalcy, until Bonnie broke off the engagement in 1970, a rejection that some investigators believe may have been a significant psychological trigger. DeAngelo's response to this rejection was not outwardly dramatic, but the timeline of his criminal activity suggests that something fundamental shifted in him around this time, and the years that followed will reveal the full and horrifying extent of that shift. The earliest crimes attributed to DeAngelo took place in Visalia, California, between 1974 and 1975, and they were, at first, largely written off as the work of a particularly bold and skilled burglar. The individual who would come to be known as the Visalia ransacker broke into more than 100 homes in the Visalia area during this period, stealing items of little monetary value, coins, small jewelry, personal mementos, while leaving behind evidence of a deeply intrusive and voyeuristic presence. He moved through homes with eerie confidence, rearranging items, eating food from refrigerators, and leaving behind deliberate traces of his presence in ways that suggested he wanted his victims to know he had been there. He was meticulous about avoiding fingerprints, wore gloves consistently, and demonstrated a level of operational security that spoke to careful premeditation. In September 1975, the ransacker crossed a critical line when he shot and killed Claude Snelling, a journalism professor, who confronted him while he was attempting to abduct Snelling's 16-year-old daughter, Beth. This murder, the first directly attributed to DeAngelo, went unsolved for decades, but established a pattern that would become his hallmark: the willingness to use lethal violence without hesitation when his plans were threatened. Several months later, in December 1975, a Visalia police detective named William McGowan came face-to-face with a ransacker in a darkened street and was nearly killed when the suspect shot at him and escaped into the night. The ransacker's activities in Visalia ceased shortly afterward, and investigators would later understand why. Because DeAngelo had simply moved his operations to a different part of California, where he had already begun laying the groundwork for a new and even more terrifying chapter of his criminal career. Beginning in June 1976, a series of sexual assaults began occurring in the Sacramento area that would horrify the region and confound law enforcement for years. The attacker, who would come to be known as the East Area Rapist, operated with a level of sophistication and planning that was unlike anything investigators had encountered before. He stalked his victims methodically, sometimes for weeks or even months before striking, learning their routines, their schedules, the layout of their homes, and the patterns of their neighborhoods with the patience of a hunter who had all the time in the world. He would break into homes in the dead of night, wake his victims by shining a flashlight in their faces, and issue commands in controlled, practiced whisper that left no room for resistance. When couples were present, he would bind the male victim, often stacking dishes on his back and threatening to kill everyone in the house if he heard the dishes move, while he subjected the female victim to hours of rape and psychological torture in another room. His attacks were not impulsive or disorganized. They were the product of careful reconnaissance, precise timing, and a chilling self-control that allowed him to spend extended periods inside his victims' homes without losing composure. He brought his own supplies, rope ligatures, sometimes food, and he spoke to his victims in ways that suggested a complex inner psychology, alternating between cold commands and occasional, disturbing moment of apparent vulnerability, including an instance in which he was reportedly heard crying to himself and muttering about his mother. Between June 1976 and July 1979, he committed at least 50 rapes across Sacramento, Contra Costa, Santa Barbara, Fresno, and other California counties, terrorizing an enormous geographic area and evading every attempt by law enforcement to identify or apprehend him. Despite a massive investigative effort that included stakeouts, tip lines, and the deployment of significant law enforcement resources, the East Area Rapist seemed to exist outside the reach of consequence, moving freely through communities that lived in a state of collective fear, and installing deadbolts, leaving porch lights on all night, and sleeping with weapons within reach. Then, in 1979, the crimes escalated in a way that shattered any remaining hope that the attacker might eventually be satisfied with the devastation he had already caused. In February of that year, a couple named Brian and Katie Maggiore were shot and killed in Rancho Cordova after apparently encountering the East Area Rapist while he was prowling in their neighborhood. These murders marked the beginning of a new and even darker phase, as the attacker, now operating primarily in Southern California, began targeting couples for murder rather than rape. Between 1979 and 1986, he killed 11 more people in a series of brutal attacks in Santa Barbara, Ventura, and Orange counties, using a blitz-style attack that involved binding both victims and then bludgeoning them to death. The victims included Robert Offerman and Alexandria Manning, killed in Goleta in December 1979, Lyman and Charlene Smith, killed in Ventura in March 1980, Keith and Patrice Harrington, killed in Dana Point in August 1980, Manuela Withun, killed alone in Irvine in February 1981, Sherry Domingo and Gregory Sanchez, killed in Goleta in July 1981, Janelle Cruz, killed alone in Irvine in May 1986. This last murder, the killing of 18-year-old Janelle Cruz, will be the final crime attributed to DeAngelo, and then silence. The original Night Stalker, as Southern California investigators had named him, simply stopped, leaving behind a body count, a mountain of physical evidence that could not yet be matched to any suspect, and a mystery that would consume investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths for the next 3 decades. DeAngelo, meanwhile, had been fired from the Auburn Police Department in 1979 after being caught shoplifting a can of dog repellent and a hammer, items that investigators would later note were consistent with his criminal toolkit, and had moved on to work as a truck mechanic, eventually settling into a quiet life in the Sacramento suburb of Citrus Heights, where he lived with his daughter and grandchildren and gave every outward appearance of being an ordinary retired man. The investigation that would ultimately unmask DeAngelo is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of forensic science, and it begins with the work of a woman who never lived to see its conclusion. Michelle McNamara was a true crime writer and the wife of comedian Patton Oswalt, and she became obsessed with the case of the Golden State Killer, a name she herself coined in a 2013 Los Angeles Magazine article. Spending years compiling evidence, corresponding with investigators, and working to bring renewed public attention to the case, her book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, was published posthumously in 2018 after her sudden death in 2016, and it reignited public and investigative interest in the case at a moment when new forensic technology was making the previously impossible suddenly achievable. The breakthrough came through the use of investigative genetic genealogy, a technique that had been pioneered by genetic genealogist C.C. Moore and others, which involved uploading crime scene DNA to public genealogy databases and using the resulting family matches to build family trees and work backward toward potential suspects. In 2017, the FBI, the California Department of Justice, and local investigators working the Golden State Killer case partnered with the private forensic company Parabon Nanolabs and genetic genealogist Barbara Ray Venner to apply this technique to the decades-old DNA evidence that had been collected from crime scenes across California. The process was painstaking and required building out family trees that sometimes contained hundreds of individuals, but was also extraordinarily powerful, and by early 2018, investigators had narrowed their focus to a small number of potential suspects in the Sacramento area. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. emerged as the strongest candidate, and investigators began conducting covert surveillance to obtain a sample of his DNA without alerting him to their interest. In March 2018, surveillance teams recovered discarded items, a car door handle and a tissue, from outside DeAngelo's home in Citrus Heights, and the DNA extracted from these items was sent for comparison with the Golden State Killer's DNA profile. The match was conclusive. On April 24, 2018, more than a dozen law enforcement officers descended on DeAngelo's home in Citrus Heights and arrested him in his driveway as he emerged from his front door. He was 72 years old, wearing a shirt and underwear, and he reportedly muttered, "I have a roast in the oven," as officers approached him, a surreal and almost incomprehensible response from a man who had just been identified as one of the most prolific serial killers and rapists in American history. The legal proceedings that followed DeAngelo's arrest were complicated by his age, his health, and the sheer volume and geographic spread of his crimes, but they ultimately resulted in one of the most significant criminal resolutions in California history. DeAngelo was charged with 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping, along with numerous other charges related to his rape crimes, though the statute of limitations had expired on many of the sexual assault charges, meaning that the full scope of his crimes against the surviving rape victims could not be fully prosecuted. In a plea agreement reached in June 2020, DeAngelo pleaded guilty to all 13 murders and 13 kidnapping charges, as well as admitting to the additional rape crimes as part of a plea agreement that spared him the death penalty, a concession that many of his victims and their families found deeply painful, but ultimately accepted as a means of achieving finality and closure without the trauma of a prolonged trial. The sentencing hearing, held in August 2020 at a Sacramento courthouse with COVID-19 precautions in place, was one of the most emotionally devastating proceedings in recent California legal history. Over the course of several days, dozens of survivors and family members of victims took the stand to deliver victim impact statements that described in devastating detail the lifelong consequences of DeAngelo's crimes, the marriages that had broken apart under the weight of trauma, the decades of nightmares and hypervigilance, the family members who had died waiting for justice, the children who had grown up in the shadow of their parents' victimization. Several survivors addressed DeAngelo directly, looking him in the eye and telling him, with extraordinary courage, exactly what he had taken from them and from the people they loved. DeAngelo, for his part, delivered a brief and widely criticized statement in which he said, "I did listen, and I've lived in you all. words that many victims found more disturbing than comforting, as they seemed to suggest a continued sense of psychological possession rather than genuine remorse. Judge Michael Bowman sentenced DeAngelo to 11 consecutive terms of life without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would die in prison. He is currently incarcerated at the California Healthcare Facility in Stockton, California. The aftermath of DeAngelo's arrest and conviction reverberated far beyond the courtroom and touched virtually every aspect of how Americans think about cold cases, forensic science, and the long reach of justice. The use of investigative genetic genealogy in the Golden State Killer case opened a new era in cold case investigation, and within months of DeAngelo's arrest, law enforcement agencies across the United States were using the same technique to solve murders and sexual assaults that had gone cold for decades. By 2020, more than 200 violent crime cases have been solved using investigative genetic genealogy, a number that has continued to grow as the technique becomes more refined and more widely adopted. The technique also sparked significant ethical and legal debate about privacy, consent, and the use of personal genetic information in criminal investigations, debates that continue to this day and that have resulted in varying policies across different genealogy databases about whether law enforcement is permitted to use their platforms for investigative purposes. For the surviving victims of the East Area Rapist, DeAngelo's arrest brought a complicated and bittersweet form of closure. The knowledge that the man who had shattered their lives had finally been identified and held accountable, but also the painful recognition that the statute of limitations had robbed them of the full legal reckoning they deserved. Several survivors have spoken publicly about their mixed feelings, describing the relief of finally having a name and a face to attach to their trauma, while also mourning the fact that DeAngelo would not face charges specifically for the crimes committed against them. Michelle McNamara, who dedicated years of her life to hunting the Golden State Killer, and whose work played an undeniable role in reigniting the investigation that led to his capture, did not live to see the day justice was served, but her name was invoked repeatedly throughout the sentencing proceedings by victims, investigators, and family members who recognized her contribution to the outcome. Her husband, Patton Oswalt, attended the sentencing hearing and sat in the courtroom as victim after victim described what DeAngelo had taken from them, bearing witness to the resolution of a case his wife had given so much to solve. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr., the Golden State Killer, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, the Visalia Ransacker, a man of many criminal identities and none of his own making, will spend the rest of his life behind bars, a consequence that arrived 44 years too late for the victims who deserved justice from the very beginning, but one that nonetheless stands as a testament to the enduring power of forensic science, investigative persistence, and the refusal of survivors and their advocates to let the darkness win. Number 2. The BTK Killer, a monster who hid in plain sight for 30 years while an entire city lived in terror. There are crimes that shock a community, and then there are crimes that fundamentally and permanently alter the psychological landscape of an entire city, leaving behind a wound so deep that it never fully heals even after justice has been served. The story of Dennis Lynn Rader, the man who called himself BTK, an acronym he coined himself, standing for bind, torture, kill, a name he used in taunting letters to police and local media, as though his methodology were a brand identity worthy of public recognition, is one of the most disturbing and psychologically complex cases in the history of American serial murder. For more than 30 years, from 1974 to 1991, Rader murdered 10 people in and around Wichita, Kansas, targeting victims with methodical and patient cruelty that reflected a deeply organized and controlled criminal mind operating beneath an almost impenetrably ordinary exterior. He was a church president, a compliance officer, a Boy Scout leader, a husband, a father, a neighbor who attended community meetings and complained about code violations, a man so thoroughly embedded in the fabric of respectable civic life that the people who knew him best were utterly incapable of reconciling the person they thought they knew with the monster the evidence revealed him to be. His case is not simply a story about murder. It is a story about the terrifying capacity of human beings to compartmentalize, to perform normalcy with absolute conviction, and to sustain a double life for decades without detection. And it is also a story about the extraordinary and ultimately self-destructive arrogance of a killer who could not resist a need to be recognized, a need that would, after 30 years of near-perfect operational security, become the instrument of his own undoing. Dennis Lynn Rader was born on March 9, 1945, in Pittsburgh, Kansas, the eldest of four sons born to William Elvin Rader and Dorothea May Cook. His family was working class and deeply religious, attending the Lutheran Church regularly and instilling in their children the values of hard work, community involvement, and Christian faith, values that Rader would spend his entire adult life performing with conviction, while simultaneously harboring an inner world of violent fantasy that bore no relationship whatsoever to the image he projected to those around him. From an early age, Rader demonstrated signs of the psychological disturbances that would eventually manifest in murder, though these signs were either not recognized or not acted upon by the adults of his life. He was fascinated by bondage from a young age, a fascination he would later describe in chilling detail during his sentencing hearing, explaining that he had harbored violent sexual fantasies involving binding and controlling women since childhood, and that these fantasies had intensified and evolved over time in ways that he claimed he was powerless to control. He tortured and killed small animals as a child, a behavior that is now widely recognized as one of the classic early warning signs of developing psychopathy. He was a voyeur who spied on women in their homes, a habit he maintained throughout his adult life alongside his marriage and his community activities, collecting clippings, photographs, and personal items from his victims and potential victims in a private archive of fantasy material that he kept hidden from his family for decades. He served in the United States Air Force from 1966 to 1970, receiving training in electronics and communications, before returning to Kansas and enrolling at Wichita State University, where he eventually earned a degree in administration of justice. Again, a deeply ironic academic choice given the crimes he was already beginning to contemplate. He married Paula Dietz in 1971, and the couple would go on to have 2 children, a son and a daughter, building a family life in the Wichita suburb of Park City that appeared, from every outward angle, to be entirely unremarkable and entirely respectable. The first murders attributed to Dennis Rader took place on January 15, 1974, and they announced his presence in the most horrifying way imaginable, not with a single targeted killing, but with the annihilation of an entire family. The Otero family, Joseph Otero, 38, his wife Julie, 34, and 2 of their 5 children, Joseph 2, 9, and Josephine, 11, were killed in their home on North Edgemore Street in Wichita in an attack that began in the early morning hours after Rader entered the house by cutting a phone line and removing a window air conditioning unit. Joseph Otero was strangled with a cord. Julie Otero was strangled and suffocated with a plastic bag placed over her head. Young Joseph, too, was strangled with a cord while lying on his bed. Josephine, the 11-year-old daughter, was taken to the basement, where Rader hanged her from a pipe, a detail so grotesque and deliberate that it communicated, with horrible clarity, the nature of the sexual fantasy that was driving his actions. The 3 older Otero children, who had already left for school before the attack began, returned home to discover the bodies of their family members, a trauma that would define the rest of their lives. The murders caused immediate and widespread panic in Wichita, but investigators had almost nothing to work with, no witnesses, no usable fingerprints, and no apparent motive, since the Oteros did not appear to have been specifically targeted in any conventional sense. The crime scene suggested organization and deliberate planning, but the identity of the killer remained completely unknown. Rader would later explain, in the flat, clinical tone that characterized all of his public statements about his crimes, that he had originally planned to abduct and rape Josephine, but had changed his approach after finding the whole family at home, deciding instead to kill everyone present to eliminate witnesses, a statement that revealed, with nauseating clarity, the purely instrumental way in which he regarded human life. Rader's second murder took place on April 4, 1974, less than 3 months after the Otero killings, when he broke into the home of Catherine Bright, 21, on East 13th Street in Wichita. Rader had not expected Catherine to have company, and when he entered the home, he found her there with her brother Kevin, 19. Rader bound both siblings and attempted to strangle Catherine, but Kevin managed to break free and struggled with Rader, during which Rader shot Kevin twice in the head before Kevin escaped through the front door. Rader, believing Kevin to be fatally wounded, returned to Catherine and strangled her to death before fleeing. Kevin Bright survived his wounds, becoming one of the only people ever to survive a direct encounter with BTK, an extraordinary fact given the calculated brutality of Rader's methods. But he was unable to provide investigators with descriptions sufficiently detailed to identify his attacker. Kevin Bright carried the physical and psychological scars of that encounter for the rest of his life, and he would ultimately live to see the man who murdered his sister and nearly killed him stand in a Wichita courtroom and confess to his crimes. After the Bright murder, there was a period of relative quiet, a gap that investigators would later attribute to Rader managing his compulsions through fantasy and voyeurism, before the killings resumed with the murder of Shirley Vian on March 17, 1977. Shirley Vian, 24, was a young mother whose 3 children were present in the home when Rader broke in. In a chilling act of practical calculation, Rader locked the children in the bathroom, ignoring their screams and pounding on the door, while he strangled their mother with a plastic bag. He then left the scene without harming the children, a decision that was not, investigators noted, evidence of any moral limit, but rather a reflection of the fact that the children did not fit the profile of the victims he was seeking. The children survived to tell investigators what they had witnessed, adding another layer of devastating trauma to a case already overflowing with it. Less than a year later, on December 8, 1977, Rader committed what would become perhaps his most widely discussed murder when he killed Nancy Fox, 25, in her home on South Pershing Street in Wichita. Nancy Fox was single, living alone, and had been under surveillance by Rader for some time before the night. He broke into her home, bound her, and strangled her with a nylon stocking. The murder itself was consistent with Rader's established pattern, but what followed it was not. The next morning, Rader used a payphone to call the Wichita police dispatcher and report the murder himself, providing the address and hanging up without identifying himself, a communication that investigators recognized immediately as a deliberate act of self-aggrandizement designed to ensure that the police knew who was responsible for what they would find. This call was followed, over the subsequent years, by a series of letters, poems, and packages sent to local media and law enforcement in which Rader claimed responsibility for his murders, demanded public recognition, complained that he was not receiving sufficient media coverage, and provided details of his crimes that could only have been known to the killer. Communications that simultaneously aided investigators by confirming the existence of a single perpetrator and taunted them with the apparent impossibility of catching him. In one particularly chilling communication, Rader sent a letter to a local television station in which he included a poem he had written about the Otero murders, describing his crimes in a kind of self-satisfied, almost literary language that suggested a man deeply in love with his own perceived sophistication. These communications were profoundly disturbing to investigators not only because of their content, but because of what they revealed about Rader's psychology, a man who committed murder, at least in part, to fulfill a need for recognition and significance that his ordinary daily life apparently failed to satisfy. The murders continued. On April 28, 1979, Rader killed Maureen Hedge, 53, who lived on the same street as Rader himself in Park City, a detail that speaks volumes about his audacity and his confidence in his own invisibility within the community. He strangled Hedge, transported her body to his church, where he photographed it in various posed positions for his own gratification, and then disposed of the body in a ditch. He killed Vicki Wegerle, 28, on September 16, 1986, entering her home by posing as a telephone repairman, strangling her, and then leaving before her husband returned home, an attack so efficiently executed that Vicki's husband was initially considered a suspect by investigators, a miscarriage of investigative focus that caused the Wegerle family enormous additional suffering. Rader's final murder took place on January 19, 1991, when he killed Dolores Davis, 62, in her home in Park City, strangling her and then disposing of her body beneath a bridge. After the Davis murder, Rader went silent again, a silence that lasted for more than 13 years and that investigators were unable to explain, though Rader would later suggest that he had simply decided to stop, a claim that many criminal psychologists found unconvincing, and that seemed to reflect more about his need to present himself as in control than about any genuine cessation of violent impulse. The silence broke in March 2004, 30 years after his first murders, when a letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle newspaper containing a photocopy of Vicki Wegerle's driver's license and photographs of her body taken by Rader at the crime scene, items that could only have been in the possession of her killer. The letter reignited the BTK investigation with enormous intensity, and Rader followed it with a series of additional communications over the next several months, apparently unable to resist the attention his reemergence was generating. Investigators, now working with forensic and communications technology that had not existed during the original investigation, worked carefully to analyze every communication for traceable evidence, while simultaneously engaging in a strategy of indirect communication designed to keep Rader engaged without alerting him to the progress they were making. The fatal mistake came in February 2005, when Rader sent investigators a pink floppy disk containing a message, after investigators responded to one of his communications with a deliberately crafted public message suggesting that floppy disks could not be traced, a statement that was entirely false and was specifically designed to exploit Rader's arrogance and his apparent belief that he was technologically sophisticated enough to communicate safely in the digital age. Rader took the bait. Metadata recovered from the floppy disk led investigators directly to Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita, where a man named Dennis Rader served as the congregation's president. Further investigation rapidly confirmed what the metadata had suggested. Dennis Rader, the church president, the compliance officer, the Boy Scout leader, the neighbor, was BTK. On February 25th, 2005, law enforcement officers arrested Dennis Rader during a traffic stop near his home in Park City, Kansas. He was 59 years old, and he had been living freely in the same community where he had committed murders for 31 years. His arrest sent shockwaves through Wichita and through the national true crime community, not only because of the identity of the suspect, an apparently respectable, deeply embedded community member, but because of the manner in which he had been caught, through a trap set using his own arrogance as the mechanism. The reaction of those who knew him was one of the defining elements of the case's cultural impact, neighbors, church members, and former colleagues speaking to reporters in tones of absolute disbelief, describing a man they had known for decades and finding that they were completely unable to reconcile that person with the monster the evidence described. His wife of 34 years, Paula, was reportedly devastated, and the couple's marriage did not survive his arrest. His children, who had grown up in his home entirely unaware of his secret life, were left to navigate a public and private reckoning that no amount of time could fully resolve. Rader himself, in the period between his arrest and his sentencing, demonstrated a psychological profile that fascinated and disturbed criminal investigators and psychologists in equal measure. He was cooperative with investigators, providing detailed confessions to all 10 murders with clinical detachment that suggested a man describing administrative procedures rather than acts of savage violence. And he showed a persistent and troubling tendency to speak about his crimes in terms that prioritized his own narrative and his own experience over any acknowledgement of the humanity of his victims. The legal proceedings against Dennis Rader moved relatively quickly given the volume and complexity of his crimes. He was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder, and in June 2005, he stood in a Sedgwick County courtroom and delivered a guilty plea that was unlike anything the court had previously witnessed, a methodical, detailed, almost professorial account of each of his 10 murders, delivered in a flat, unemotional tone that drew audible reactions of horror from the gallery, and that caused several family members of victims to leave the courtroom rather than continue to listen. Rader described his victims using terms like projects, spoke about the practical challenges of each murder with a language of problem-solving, and at several points appeared to enjoy the attention proceedings were affording him, a behavioral observation noted by multiple investigators and psychologists who were present. Judge Gregory Waller, who presided over the sentencing hearing, delivered 10 consecutive life sentences, the maximum available under Kansas law, since Kansas had abolished the death penalty in 1972 and had not reinstated it before Rader's crimes were committed, meaning that death was not a sentencing option regardless of the nature or number of his crimes, a legal reality that many of his victims' family members found deeply unjust. Rader is currently incarcerated at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he will remain for the rest of his natural life without any possibility of parole. The legacy of the BTK case extends far beyond the boundaries of Wichita and far beyond the boundaries of criminal investigation into territory that touches on fundamental questions about human nature, community, and the limits of our ability to know the people among whom we live. The case has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and academic studies, and it continues to be used as a primary teaching case in criminal psychology and behavioral analysis programs, because of the extraordinary richness and clarity of the psychological portrait provides. The use of metadata forensics in catching Rader was a watershed moment in digital criminal investigation, establishing for the first time in a high-profile case that digital communications contained traceable information that could be exploited by investigators even when a suspect believed they had taken precautions against identification. The case also raised profound and uncomfortable questions about the nature of community trust and the social systems through which predators camouflage themselves. Questions that remain deeply relevant in a world where performance of respectability continues to be one of the most effective tools available to individuals who wish to conceal destructive inner lives. For the survivors and the family members of Rader's victims, the resolution of the case brought a form of justice that was real but necessarily incomplete. The knowledge that the man responsible for his suffering was finally identified, finally held accountable, and finally removed permanently from the community he had terrorized, balanced against the recognition that 31 years had been stolen from them, that loved ones had died never knowing their killer's name, and that no sentence, however severe, could restore what had been taken. Dennis Lynn Rader, who bound, tortured, and killed 10 people and then spent 3 decades living as a free man among the very community he had victimized, will die in a Kansas prison, a conclusion that arrived far too late, but one that nonetheless affirms the principle that even the most carefully constructed mass of normalcy cannot ultimately withstand the weight of the truth beneath it. Number 3. The murder of Marcia Trimble, a case that haunted an entire city for more than 3 decades before a devastating truth finally emerged from the shadows. There are cases that become permanently woven into the identity of the city, cases so shocking and so deeply felt that they alter the collective consciousness of an entire community in ways that persist long after the immediate horror has faded. The murder of Marcia Trimble in Nashville, Tennessee, is exactly such a case, a crime so disturbing in its nature, so prolonged in its mystery, and so devastating in its ultimate resolution that it left an indelible mark on Nashville's sense of itself and on the lives of everyone connected to it. Marcia Trimble was 9 years old on February 25, 1975, when she set out from her family's home on Copeland Drive in the Green Hills neighborhood of Nashville to deliver Girl Scout cookies to neighbors, a task so ordinary, so innocent, and so perfectly emblematic of childhood that its association with what followed makes the crime feel almost unbearably cruel. She left her house in the late afternoon carrying a small amount of money and a bag of cookies, walked to a neighbor's house, made her delivery, and then simply vanished, disappearing into the quiet, tree-lined streets of one of Nashville's most comfortable and seemingly safest residential neighborhoods in a way that left no witnesses, no trail, and no immediate explanation. Her disappearance triggered one of the largest searches in Tennessee history, mobilizing hundreds of volunteers, law enforcement officers, and community members who combed the Green Hills neighborhood for days, and then weeks without finding any trace of the little girl. And then, 33 days after she vanished, on March 30th, 1975, Marcia Trimble's body was found hidden in a garage less than 200 yards from her own home, so close that searchers had passed the location multiple times without discovering her. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The discovery of her body answered the most urgent question, while simultaneously raising a new and even more agonizing one. Who had done this, and why had it taken 33 years to find out? Marcia and Trimble was born on May 17, 1965, the daughter of Charles and Virginia Trimble, a middle-class Nashville family living in the kind of comfortable suburban neighborhood that represented, in the mid-1970s, everything that American domestic life was supposed to mean: safety, community, the freedom of children to move through their own neighborhoods without fear. Green Hills in 1975 was the kind of place where children walked to school alone, rode their bikes to friends' houses without supervision, and knocked on neighbors' doors selling cookies for school fundraisers without anyone thinking twice about the safety of such activities. It was precisely this atmosphere of comfortable normalcy that made Marcia's disappearance so shocking to community and so difficult for her family to initially process. The idea that something terrible could happen to a child in such a place, in broad daylight, in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, seemed almost impossible to accept. Marcia was, by all accounts, a bright, cheerful, and responsible child who was well-liked by her classmates and neighbors, and who had undertaken the cookie delivery errand with the kind of casual confidence that came from growing up in an environment where such activities had always been entirely safe. She was wearing jeans and a blue jacket when she left her house that afternoon, carrying her Girl Scout cookies and the small amount of money she had collected from previous deliveries, and she had told her mother she would be back soon. She never came back. The hours between her disappearance and the moment her parents realized something was truly wrong were filled with the ordinary uncertainty that parents feel when a child is a little later than expected. The initial assumption that she had stopped to play with a friend, that she had lost track of time, that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Before that uncertainty curdled into alarm, and then into the full, suffocating panic of parents who understand that something has gone terribly wrong. The search for Marcia Trimble was, by any measure, an extraordinary community mobilization. Within hours of her disappearance being reported to the Nashville Metropolitan Police Department, hundreds of neighbors, community members, and volunteers had joined law enforcement in searching the Green Hills area. The search continued for days and weeks, encompassing not only the immediate neighborhood but surrounding areas, parks, and vacant lots, as investigators and volunteers worked systematically through every possible location where a missing child might be found. The Nashville community was gripped by the case in a way that reflected both the genuine affection the neighborhood felt for the Trimble family and the deep, universal fear that any child's disappearance triggers in parents and families everywhere. Tips poured into the police department from across the city and beyond, and investigators followed up on hundreds of leads without finding any trace of Marcia or any credible information about what had happened to her. The 33 days between her disappearance and the discovery of her body were a period of sustained, agonizing uncertainty for her family and for the broader community, a period during which hope and dread existed in a terrible equilibrium that was finally and catastrophically resolved on March 30th, 1975, when a neighborhood child discovered Marcia's body hidden in the garage of a vacant property on Estes Road, less than 200 yards from the Trimble family home. The garage had reportedly been searched at least once during the initial investigation, raising questions about how the body had remained undiscovered for so long, questions that would become the subject of significant scrutiny and controversy in the years that followed. The medical examination confirmed that Marcia had been sexually assaulted and strangled, and that she had been killed relatively shortly after her disappearance, meaning that for most of 33 days during which Nashville had been searching for her, she had already been dead, hidden in a garage so close to her home that the distance between the place where she was last seen alive and the place where her body was found was smaller than the length of a city block. The investigation that followed the discovery of Marcia's body was one of the most extensive in Nashville's history, and it produced, over the course of the following years, an almost bewildering array of suspects, theories, dead ends, and controversies that would ultimately come to define the case as much as the crime itself. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery, investigators focused their attention on the neighborhood and on individuals who had been in the area around the time of Marcia's disappearance. One of the first individuals to come under serious suspicion was a young man named Jeffrey Womack, a teenager who lived in the neighborhood and who had been seen in the area on the evening of Marcia's disappearance. Womack was subjected to intense scrutiny and was at various points considered a prime suspect by segments of the investigation, and the suspicion that attached him would follow him for decades despite the fact that he was never charged with any crime in connection with Marcia's murder. The focus on Womack, which some investigators and community members believe was misdirected from an early stage, became one of the most controversial aspects of the case and contributed to a broader narrative about investigative failures and misplaced focus that would be examined extensively when the case was finally resolved. Over the years that followed, the investigation generated numerous other suspects and theories, none of which resulted in charges, and the case gradually transitioned from an active homicide investigation into a cold case, one of Nashville's most notorious and most painful unresolved mysteries. The case remained cold for more than 3 decades, but was never entirely forgotten, and the Nashville Metropolitan Police Department periodically revisited it as new investigative tools and technologies became available. The breakthrough that would ultimately solve the case came through the use of DNA technology that had not existed at the time of the original investigation. In the early 2000s, investigators submitted biological evidence recovered from Marcia's body to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation Crime Laboratory for DNA analysis, and the resulting DNA profile was entered into a combined DNA index system, known as CODIS, the national database that allows investigators to match crime scene DNA against profiles collected from convicted offenders across the country. For several years, the DNA profile generated no matches, a frustrating but not uncommon outcome in cold case DNA investigations. since the database is only as useful as the profiles it contains, and a match can only occur if the perpetrator has been convicted of another offense and had their DNA collected as a result. Then, in 2007, a match emerged from the Cody's database, a match to a man named Jerome Sydney Barrett, a convicted rapist whose DNA had been collected following a sexual assault conviction in a separate case. Barrett's DNA profile matched the biological evidence recovered from Marcia Trimble's body with statistical certainty that left no room for doubt, and investigators who had spent years working the cold case found themselves confronting a name that they could now attach, with scientific certainty, to the murder of a 9-year-old girl 32 years earlier. Jerome Sydney Barrett was not an unknown quantity to Nashville law enforcement by the time the DNA match identified him as Marcia Trimble's killer. Barrett had a criminal history that extended back decades and that included convictions for rape and other violent offenses, a history that, in retrospect, made the DNA match feel not only conclusive but deeply and bitterly ironic, since it raised the inevitable question of whether a more thorough investigation in 1975 might have identified Barrett as a suspect at a time when he could have been charged and convicted before he went on to commit additional crimes against other victims. Barrett was born in 1947 and had grown up in Nashville. At the time of Marcia Trimble's murder, he was a young man in his late 20s living in the broader Nashville area. He had no known connection to the Trimble family and no obvious reason to have targeted Marcia specifically, and investigators working the case after the DNA match concluded that he most likely encountered her opportunistically on the evening of her cookie delivery route, a conclusion that made the crime feel simultaneously random and inevitable in the way that the worst crimes often do, the intersection of a child's innocent errand and a predator's proximity, producing a tragedy that no amount of precaution could have been guaranteed to prevent. Barrett had subsequently been convicted of rape in a case involving a different victim, had served prison time, and had been released, living as a free man in the years between Marcia's murder and the DNA match that finally exposed him, years during which the Trimble family had been left without answers and without justice while the man responsible for their daughter's death moved through the world unconstrained. The arrest of Jerome Sydney Barrett in 2007, following the DNA match, sent shockwaves through Nashville in a way that reverberated with particular intensity, given the length of time the case had remained unsolved and the degree to which it had embedded itself in the city's collective memory. For the Trimble family, and particularly for Virginia Trimble, Marcia's mother, who had spent more than 3 decades living with the knowledge of what had happened to her daughter, without knowing who was responsible, the identification of Barrett brought a complicated and painful form of relief, the end of one kind of suffering and the beginning of another, as the family was forced to relive the trauma of Marcia's murder in the context of legal proceedings that would finally hold her killer accountable. Charles Trimble, Marcia's father, had died in 1995 without ever knowing what killed his daughter. One of the most tragic dimensions of a case already overflowing with tragedy, the knowledge that one of the 2 people who had suffered most directly from the crime's 30-year shadow had not lived to see its resolution. Virginia Trimble, who had advocated tirelessly for her daughter's case over the decades and who had never stopped pushing for answers, was present throughout the legal proceedings and delivered a victim impact statement at Barrett's sentencing that was, by all accounts, one of the most powerful and heartbreaking statements ever delivered in a Nashville courtroom. The legal proceedings against Jerome Sydney Barrett moved through the Davidson County criminal court system over the course of the following year, complicated somewhat by the passage of time and the challenges associated with presenting evidence from a 1975 crime in a 2008 trial. The prosecution's case rested heavily on the DNA evidence, which was so conclusive and so scientifically robust that it effectively anchored the entire proceeding. But prosecutors also presented additional evidence connecting Barrett to the crime scene and to the area where Marcia had disappeared. Barrett's defense team challenged various aspects of the prosecution's case, as defense attorneys are obligated to do. But the DNA evidence was essentially insurmountable, and the trial proceeded with a sense of inevitability that reflected the scientific certainty of the core evidence. In 2008, Jerome Sydney Barrett was convicted of the first-degree murder of Marcia Trimble and sentenced to life imprisonment, a sentence that arrived 33 years after the crime, and that brought a degree of formal justice to a case that had seemed, for so many years, destined to remain forever unresolved. Barrett was also convicted of rape in connection with the assault on Marcia, and the life sentence he received ensured that he would spend the remainder of his days in a Tennessee prison. The conviction also prompted investigators to re-examine Barrett's possible involvement in other unsolved crimes from the same period, and while additional charges were not pursued, the re-examination underscored a broader investigative principle that the resolution of one cold case often opens doors into others that have been waiting for exactly this kind of breakthrough. The resolution of the Marcia Trimble case also reignited the controversy surrounding the earlier focus on Jeffrey Womack, the neighbor's son who had been considered a suspect in the years following the murder and whose life had been significantly affected by the suspicion that had attached to him. Womack had consistently maintained his innocence, and the DNA evidence that identified Barrett as the killer effectively exonerated Womack of any involvement in Marcia's death, a development that prompted significant reflection on the investigative decisions made in the original case and on the consequences of misplaced suspicion for the individuals on whom it falls. Womack spoke publicly after conviction, expressing relief at the final resolution of the case and the formal clearing of his name, while also acknowledging the decades of difficulty that the cloud of suspicion had created in his life. The Nashville Metropolitan Police Department was also required to engage in a degree of institutional self-examination regarding the investigation's original trajectory, a process that produced some defensive responses, but also, to the department's credit, some genuine reflection on the investigative practices and assumptions that had shaped the case's early years. The case became a teaching example in discussions of cold case investigation and the importance of preserving and properly cataloging physical evidence across decades, a lesson whose value is difficult to overstate given the number of cold cases that have been solved, like this one, through DNA analysis of evidence collected at the original crime scene. The murder of Marcia Trimble and its eventual resolution carry an importance that extends well beyond the individual tragedy at their center, though that individual tragedy, a 9-year-old girl delivering cookies in her neighborhood, a family robbed of their daughter, and a community robbed of its innocence, is itself of enormous weight and significance. The case is a powerful illustration of the principle that physical evidence, properly preserved, retains its evidentiary value across decades, and that the development of forensic technology means that crimes committed long before those technologies existed can still be solved when the biological evidence from the original scene has been maintained. It is also a case that illustrates, with painful clarity, the human cost of investigative delays and investigative misdirection, the decades that passed during which the Trimble family lived without answers, during which Charles Trimble died without knowing his daughter's killer, and during which Jerome Sydney Barrett lived freely despite carrying the knowledge of what he had done. For Virginia Trimble, who waited 33 years for justice and who finally heard a jury pronounce Barrett guilty in a Nashville courtroom in 2008. The resolution of the case was both a profound vindication of her decades of advocacy and a bittersweet reminder of everything that the long wait had cost her and her family. Marcia Trimble, who died at 9 years old delivering Girl Scout cookies in her own neighborhood, deserved justice from the very moment her life was taken. That justice arrived 33 years late. But it arrived, carried on the back of a DNA match that science made possible and that investigators, to their credit, pursued with the diligence that Marcia's memory demanded. Jerome Sydney Barrett will die in a Tennessee prison, and the little girl whose murder haunted Nashville for more than 3 decades will not be forgotten. Number 4. The assassination of Medgar Evers, a murder rooted in racial hatred that took 31 years and 3 trials to finally deliver justice. There are crimes that exist not merely as individual acts of violence, but as symptoms of something far larger and far more systemic. Crimes that serve as defining moments in a nation's history, that crystallize the tensions and contradictions of an era, and that demand from the legal and moral framework of that nation a response proportionate to their gravity and their meaning. The assassination of Medgar Wiley Evers on June 12, 1963, in the driveway of his home in Jackson, Mississippi, is precisely such a crime. Evers was not simply a murder victim. He was one of the most important civil rights leaders in the American South, the field secretary of the Mississippi chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, a World War II veteran who had fought for his country overseas and returned home to find that the country he had defended regarded him and people who looked like him as less than full citizens, and a man of extraordinary courage who had dedicated his life to dismantling the systems of racial oppression that governed life in Mississippi with the force of law and the threat of violence. His murder, carried out by a white supremacist named Byron De La Beckwith using a high-powered rifle from an ambush position in a honeysuckle thicket across the street from his home, was not a random act of criminal violence. It was a political assassination carried out in the service of a racist ideology that sought to silence one of its most effective and most visible opponents by the most direct means available. And the story of what happened in the aftermath of that assassination. The two trials in the 1960s that ended in hung juries composed of all white men who could not bring themselves to convict a fellow white Mississippian for the murder of a black civil rights leader. The 31 years during which Byron De La Beckwith lived as a free man and was celebrated in certain quarters of Mississippi society as a hero, and the extraordinary third trial in 1994 that finally delivered the verdict that justice had demanded since 1963, is a story about the long, painful, and incomplete arc of American justice, about the courage of the individuals who refused to allow that arc to remain permanently bent toward injustice, and about the price that is paid in human lives and human dignity when a legal system fails to hold the powerful accountable for the violence they commit against the vulnerable. Medgar Evers was born on July 2, 1925, in Decatur, Mississippi, the third of 4 children of James and Jessie Evers. His early life was shaped by the brutal realities of racial segregation in the Deep South, a system that defined every aspect of daily existence for black Mississippians through a combination of law, custom, economic coercion, and the constant threat of extrajudicial violence. Evers witnessed the aftermath of racial violence as a child. A family friend was lynched when Evers was a boy, and the image of the man's clothes left hanging on a fence as a warning remained with him throughout his life. Feeling a determination to confront and dismantle the system responsible for such horrors rather than accommodate himself to it. He served in the United States Army during World War II, participating in the Normandy invasion and serving in both England and France, and returned to Mississippi in 1946 with the experience of having fought for his country's stated ideals alongside white soldiers, an experience that made the reality of segregation feel not only unjust, but specifically and personally insulting in a way that deepened rather than diminished his resolve to fight for change. In 1946, he and a group of other black veterans attempted to vote in the Democratic primary in Decatur, only to be turned away by a group of armed white men. An experience that crystallized for him the fundamental contradiction between the democratic principles for which he had risked his life and the racial oppression that governed his daily existence. He enrolled at Alcorn Agricultural and Mechanical College, where he met and married Merle Beasley in 1951, a partnership that would prove to be one of the most important personal and political alliances of the civil rights movement. After graduating, Evers worked briefly as an insurance agent before joining the NAACP, and in 1954, he became the organization's first field secretary in Mississippi, a position that placed him at the center of some of the most dangerous civil rights work in the country, and that made him, almost immediately, a target for the violent elements of Mississippi's white supremacist infrastructure. As the NAACP's Mississippi Field Secretary, Medgar Evers operated in one of the most hostile and dangerous environments in the entire civil rights movement. Mississippi in the 1950s and early 1960s was a state where racial violence was not merely tolerated, but effectively sanctioned by the legal and political establishment, where black citizens who attempted to exercise their constitutional rights faced not only legal obstruction, but the very real threat of murder, and where the organizations that sought to enforce those rights operated under conditions of constant surveillance, harassment, and intimidation. Evers threw himself into this work with a combination of strategic intelligence and personal courage that made him extraordinarily effective, and that also made him an extraordinarily prominent target. He investigated racial murders throughout Mississippi, including the 1955 murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till, whose killing had galvanized the national civil rights movement, and worked to publicize these crimes in ways that brought national and international attention to the systematic violence undergirding Mississippi's racial order. He organized voter registration drives in a state where black citizens were systematically denied the right to vote through a combination of literacy tests, poll taxes, economic intimidation, and outright violence. He led boycotts of white-owned businesses in Jackson that had demonstrated a willingness to harm rather than serve their black customers. He worked tirelessly to desegregate the University of Mississippi and other state institutions. And when James Meredith became the first black student to enroll at Ole Miss in 1962, an event that triggered riots and required the intervention of federal marshals and the National Guard, Evers was deeply involved in the effort that had made Meredith's enrollment possible. He received death threats regularly. His home was firebombed, and he was followed, surveilled, and harassed by members of the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission, a state agency created specifically to resist civil rights and to monitor and disrupt the activities of civil rights leaders. Through all of this, Evers continued his work with a clarity of purpose and a personal fearlessness that those who knew him described as almost breathtaking, a man who understood perfectly well the risks he was taking and had made a deliberate choice to take them anyway because he believed, with the conviction of someone who had thought deeply about what was right and what was necessary, that the cause demanded nothing less. Byron De La Beckwith was, in almost every measurable way, the embodiment of the system that Medgar Evers had dedicated his life to dismantling. Born on November 9, 1920, in Colusa, California, Beckwith had moved to Mississippi as a child following his father's death and had been raised in Greenwood by relatives who instilled in him the racial attitudes that were standard in a certain stratum of Mississippi white society. He served in the United States Marine Corps during World War II, seeing combat at Guadalcanal, and returned to Mississippi after the war to work as a salesman and to involve himself in the network of white supremacist organizations that were mobilizing in response to the civil rights movement's growing strength. He was a member of the White Citizens Council, a more socially respectable vehicle for white supremacist ideology than the Ku Klux Klan, but one that shared the Klan's fundamental commitment to maintaining racial segregation and resisting black civil rights by whatever means necessary. He was also, by his own subsequent admission and boast, a member of organizations far more explicitly committed to violence, and he made no particular secret of his views on race, expressing them freely in social settings and in written communications that would later become important evidence in the trials against him. He was, in short, exactly the kind of man who regarded Medgar Evers not merely as a political opponent, but as a personal enemy and an existential threat to the social order he believed in and was prepared to defend with lethal force. The night of June 11, 1963, was a significant one in the national civil rights movement. President John F. Kennedy had delivered a nationally televised address that evening announcing his intention to submit a comprehensive civil rights bill to Congress, a speech that represented one of the most significant federal commitments to civil rights since Reconstruction, and that had enormous implications for the ongoing struggle in states like Mississippi. Medgar Evers watched the speech and then drove home from a late meeting, arriving at his house on Gwine Street in Jackson in the early hours of June 12th. As he emerged from his car carrying NAACP T-shirts and walked toward his front door, a single rifle shot rang out from the darkness across the street. The bullet struck Evers in the back, passed through his body, and he staggered and fell in his driveway, crawling toward his front door as his wife Merle and their 3 children, Daryl, Rena, and James, rushed out to find him. His children, who had been watching President Kennedy's civil rights speech on television and had been told by their father not to wait up for him, ran to where he lay and cradled him as neighbors gathered and emergency services were called. Medgar Evers was taken to University of Mississippi Medical Center, where he died approximately 50 minutes after being shot, becoming one of the most prominent martyrs of the civil rights movement and setting off a wave of grief, outrage, and protest that reverberated across the country. He was 37 years old. President Kennedy issued a statement expressing his condolences and his determination to pass civil rights legislation, and Evers was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, the resting place of nation's heroes, a final recognition of the service he had given to a country that had not yet fully recognized his humanity while he lived. The investigation into Evers' murder moved quickly in one direction, toward Byron De La Beckwith. Within days of the assassination, investigators found the rifle used in the shooting, a Golden Hawk .30-06 Enfield rifle, in the honeysuckle thicket across the street from the Evers home. The rifle was traced to Beckwith, and fingerprint evidence linked Beckwith directly to the weapon. Multiple witnesses placed Beckwith in Jackson in the days before the murder, and a cab driver reported that Beckwith had asked him for directions to Evers' home shortly before the killing. Beckwith was arrested on June 23, 1963. Less than 2 weeks after murder, and charged with first-degree murder, a development that many in the civil rights movement hoped would signal that Mississippi's legal system was capable of delivering justice regardless of the race of the victim or the ideology of the perpetrator. Those hopes would prove, at least in the short term, to be tragically misplaced. The first trial of Byron De La Beckwith began in January 1964 before an all-white jury. the inevitable result of the systematic exclusion of black citizens from jury roles in Mississippi, and ended in a hung jury after the jurors were unable to reach a unanimous verdict. A second trial, held several months later before another all-white jury, produced the same result. Another hung jury, another failure to convict, another affirmation of the extent to which the racial politics of Mississippi could corrupt the administration of justice when the victim was black and the defendant was a white man with the right friends and the right beliefs. Beckwith walked free, and the case was effectively closed. The decades that followed were, for Marcia Evers and for the family and friends of Medgar Evers, a period of sustained and painful injustice. The knowledge that the man who had killed their husband, father, and friend was not only free, but was, in certain circles of Mississippi society, celebrated and admired for what he had done. Beckwith did nothing to discourage this admiration. In the years after his two mistrials, he spoke publicly and repeatedly about his alleged role in Evers' death in terms that suggested pride rather than remorse, making statements at Ku Klux Klan rallies and in private conversations that amounted to open boasting about the assassination. He ran twice for lieutenant governor of Mississippi, receiving tens of thousands of votes in a testament to the depth of racial animus that continued to shape Mississippi politics in the years after the Civil Rights Movement. He moved to Signal Mountain, Tennessee, with his second wife, continued his involvement in white supremacist organizations, and was eventually convicted in 1990 of transporting a bomb with intent to kill a regional director of the Anti-Defamation League, a conviction that resulted in a 5-year prison sentence and that kept him incarcerated when the effort to retry him for Evers' murder finally gained sufficient momentum to move forward. Marcia Evers, who had remarried and become Marcia Evers Williams, had never stopped fighting for justice for her first husband. She lobbied the Hinds County District Attorney's office for years to reopen the case, and when a new district attorney named Ed Peters and then his successor Bobby DeLauder took a serious look at the possibility of a third prosecution, it was largely because of Marcia's sustained advocacy and the new evidence she and investigators had been able to assemble over the years. The effort to prosecute Beckwith for a third time faced enormous legal and practical challenges. 3 decades had passed since the murder. Witnesses had died. Memories had faded, and the physical evidence from the original investigation had to be carefully re-examined and reassembled. The prosecution team, led by Bobby DeLauder, undertook a painstaking reconstruction of the case, locating surviving witnesses, identifying new evidence, and building a narrative that could sustain a conviction before a modern jury that would, for the first time in this case, include black members. Among the new evidence was a copy of the transcript from the second 1964 trial, which had mysteriously disappeared from the courthouse files, but was eventually located in the possession of a private individual, a discovery that proved crucial to the prosecution's ability to present evidence from the original proceedings. The prosecution also presented testimony from individuals who reported that Beckwith had made statements over the years that amounted to confessions, boasting about the killing in private conversations, expressing pride in what he had done, and behaving in ways consistent with a man who believed he had acted heroically in murdering a civil rights leader. The defense, for its part, raised challenges related to the passage of time and the fairness of a trial conducted so many years after the alleged crime, arguments that the court ultimately rejected on the grounds that the delay in prosecution had been caused by Beckwith's own conduct and by the failure of the earlier proceedings rather than by any prosecutorial misconduct. The third trial of Byron De La Beckwith began in January 1994 in Hinds County Circuit Court before a jury that, for the first time in the history of this case, reflected the racial composition of the community, 8 black jurors and 4 white jurors, a composition that stood in stark contrast to the all-white juries of 1964, and that represented, in itself, a measure of the progress that had been achieved in the intervening 3 decades. The trial lasted approximately 2 weeks and featured testimony from both surviving witnesses from the original investigation and new witnesses who had come forward with evidence of Beckwith's admissions over the years. Among the most powerful testimony was that of Marcia Evers Williams herself, who described the night of her husband's murder with a vividness and an emotional force that moved the courtroom deeply and reminded everyone present of the human reality at the center of the legal proceedings, that a man had been shot in his own driveway, that his children had run out to find him dying, and that his widow had spent 31 years fighting for a justice that the system had twice refused to deliver. On February 5, 1994, after approximately 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder, a verdict that was greeted with tears, applause, and an outpouring of emotion both inside and outside the courthouse that reflected the weight of 31 years of deferred justice finally arriving at its destination. Bobby DeLauder, the prosecutor who had led the third trial, later wrote a book about the case describing the experience of finally securing a conviction in one of the most significant civil rights murder cases in American history. Judge L. Breland Hilburn sentenced Byron De La Beckwith to life imprisonment, the maximum available under Mississippi law, a sentence that, given Beckwith's age at the time of sentencing, amounted to the same thing as a death sentence. Byron De La Beckwith was 73 years old when he was finally convicted of Medgar Evers' murder. He remained unrepentant throughout the legal proceedings, maintaining an attitude of defiant contempt for the process that was holding him accountable and showing no evidence of remorse for the assassination he had committed 3 decades earlier. He appealed his conviction multiple times, arguing that the 31-year delay between the crime and the third trial had violated his constitutional rights, arguments that were rejected by the Mississippi Supreme Court and by the United States Supreme Court, which declined to hear his final appeal. He died in prison on January 21, 2001, at the age of 80, finally and permanently beyond the reach of the freedom he had enjoyed for so long. Marcia Evers Williams, who had spent 31 years fighting for this moment, was present at the trial and at the sentencing, and she has spoken in subsequent years about the complicated nature of the justice that was finally delivered, real, meaningful, and hard-won, but also arrived so late that its full moral weight could only be appreciated against a backdrop of everything that the delay had cost. She went on to serve as chair of the NAACP National Board and to become one of the most respected voices in the American civil rights movement, carrying forward the legacy of the husband whose life was taken from him and from her in their driveway on a June night in 1963. The assassination of Medgar Evers and the extraordinary legal history of the 3 trials of Byron De La Beckwith occupy a unique and deeply important place in the history of American civil rights and American jurisprudence. The case is a reminder, first and most importantly, of the human cost of racial violence and systemic failures that allowed it to flourish, the murder of a man who had given everything to the cause of justice, the destruction of family, and the decades of pain that followed. It is also a reminder of the power of persistent advocacy in the face of institutional failure, of what Marcia Evers Williams accomplished through 31 years of refusing to accept that the legal system's failure to deliver justice in 1964 was a final word on the matter. And it is a testament to the principle that the arc of justice, however long and however painfully bent, does eventually move in the direction that truth demands, that the passage of time, while it can delay accountability, cannot ultimately prevent it when there are people willing to keep pushing for as long as it takes. The third trial of Byron De La Beckwith was not just a legal proceeding. It was a statement about who America aspired to be, a repudiation of the racial injustice that had shaped the first 2 trials, and a belated but genuine act of accountability for one of the most significant political murders in the history of the civil rights movement. Medgar Evers, who died at 37 in his own driveway carrying NAACP T-shirts, deserved that accountability from the very night he was killed. That it took 31 years and 3 trials to arrive does not diminish its meaning, but it does demand that we never forget the cost of allowing justice to be deferred for so long. Number 5. The Alphabet Murders, a series of cold case killings that remained unsolved for nearly 4 decades before retired photographers' hidden secrets finally unravel one of New York's most chilling mysteries. There are cold cases that generate a single dominant theory, a prevailing investigative narrative that shapes the direction of the investigation for years, and that, when eventually proves incorrect or incomplete, must be dismantled and rebuilt from scratch before the truth can emerge. The case of the Alphabet Murders, a series of killings that terrorized the Rochester, New York area in the early 1970s, and that derived their haunting collective name from the unusual pattern of the victims' initials, is a case that generated exactly this kind of dominant theory, one that pointed investigators in a particular direction for decades while the actual perpetrator lived freely and continued his hidden life of predation in an entirely different part of the country. The story of the Alphabet Murders is, on one level, the story of 3 young girls who were abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered in upstate New York between 1971 and 1973. Crimes so brutal and so deliberately targeted that they suggested a killer operating with specific and disturbing internal logic. On another level, It is the story of one of the most consequential investigative misidentifications in the history of New York cold case work. The decades-long focus on a suspect who, while deeply troubled in his own right, was not responsible for these murders. And on yet another level, it is the story of Joseph Henry Naso, a retired commercial photographer and self-described aesthete who had spent decades cultivating an image of artistic sophistication while maintaining, in the hidden corners of his life, a record of predatory violence that extended across multiple states and multiple decades, and that was finally exposed not to the kind of dramatic forensic breakthrough that characterizes some cold case resolutions, but through the painstaking and methodical work of investigators who refused to stop asking questions about crimes that had been waiting too long for answers. Joseph Henry Naso was born on January 7, 1934, in Rochester, New York, the city that would eventually become the geographic heart of the case against him. He grew up in Rochester during the mid-20th century, a period when the city was a thriving industrial center anchored by the Eastman Kodak Company and other major manufacturers, and he developed from an early age an intense interest in photography that would eventually become the public face of his adult identity. The persona he presented to the world as a commercial photographer, an artist, a man of visual sensibility, who saw the world through a lens and who cultivated relationships in the creative and commercial photography communities of both New York and California. Photography was not merely a professional interest for Naso. It was, as investigators would eventually discover, deeply intertwined with his criminal psychology in ways that were both practical and deeply disturbing. He used photography as a means of gaining access to women and girls, as a tool for documenting his crimes as victims, and as a vehicle for the elaborate fantasy life that investigators believe drove his predatory behavior across decades. He married and had children, lived in various locations in New York and California, and presented himself to neighbors, colleagues, and acquaintances as an eccentric but fundamentally harmless older man with artistic pretensions and strong opinions about aesthetics and culture. The reality that existed beneath this carefully maintained exterior was something entirely different. A hidden world of violence, obsession, and murder that would not begin to come fully into view until 2010, when a routine probation search in Naso's home in Reno, Nevada, revealed evidence that forced investigators to completely reframe their understanding of who he was and what he had done. The 3 murders that came to be known as the Alphabet Murders took place in the Rochester area over a period of approximately 2 years, beginning in November 1971. The victims were Carmen Colon, 10 years old, whose body was found on November 16, 1971, in Churchville, a small town outside Rochester. Wanda Valkovich, 11 years old, whose body was found on April 2, 1973, near Webster, another Rochester suburb, and Michelle Maenza, 11 years old, whose body was found on November 26, 1973, near Macedon, yet another town in the greater Rochester area. All 3 girls had been abducted while walking alone in their respective neighborhoods, had been sexually assaulted, and had been strangled before their bodies were disposed of in rural areas outside the city. The detail that gave the case its enduring name, the Alphabet Murders, sometimes also called the double initial murders, was a remarkable pattern in the victims' names: Carmen Colon, Wanda Valkovich, Michelle Maenza. Each victim's first name and last name began with the same letter, a pattern so specific and so statistically improbable as a matter of coincidence that investigators concluded almost immediately that it was not coincidental, that the killer was selecting his victims, at least in part, based on the initial letters of their names, a conclusion that spoke to a deeply unusual and deeply disturbing psychological profile. All 3 girls were also from lower-income families. All 3 were a similar age and physical type, and all 3 were found in areas that suggested the killer had local geographic knowledge and was comfortable operating across a relatively broad area of Monroe and Wayne counties. The combination of these factors, the name pattern, the victim profile, the geographic spread, the evidence of sexual assault, paint a picture of a highly organized and psychologically complex predator operating with deliberate intent. The original investigation into the Alphabet Murders was one of the most extensive in Rochester's history, involving the Monroe County Sheriff's Office, the Rochester Police Department, the New York State Police, and eventually the FBI, and it generated an enormous volume of leads, tips, and suspect information over the years following the murders. The investigation focused significant attention on a man named Kenneth Bianchi, who would later achieve notorious fame as one of the hillside stranglers responsible for a series of murders in Los Angeles and Washington state in the late 1970s. Bianchi had lived in Rochester at the time of the Alphabet murders and had been known to law enforcement in the area, and the similarities between the Rochester killings and the hillside strangler murders, particularly in terms of the sexual assault component and the organized nature of the crimes, led investigators to consider him seriously as a suspect. Bianchi was interviewed about the Rochester murders and was never definitively cleared, and the investigative focus on him as a potential suspect persisted for years, shaping the direction of the cold case investigation in ways that, in retrospect, may have slowed the process of identifying the actual perpetrator. While Bianchi's connection to the Alphabet murders was never established through physical evidence, and while he consistently denied involvement in the Rochester killings, the shadow he cast over the investigation illustrates the way in which a plausible but ultimately incorrect theory can consume investigative resources and attention in a cold case, while the actual perpetrator remains outside the frame of inquiry entirely. Joseph Naso remained entirely outside the frame of inquiry in the Alphabet murders investigation for nearly 4 decades, living his double life with facility that speaks to both the effectiveness of his self-presentation and the limitations of investigative tools available during the period when the crimes were committed. In the years following the Rochester murders, Naso relocated to California, settling eventually in the Marin County area north of San Francisco, where he continued his commercial photography work and maintained persona of an artistic eccentric with no apparent connection to violent crime. He was known to neighbors and acquaintances in California as an odd but seemingly harmless older man, opinionated about art and photography, sometimes difficult in his personal interactions, but not obviously dangerous. He had encounters with law enforcement in California related to theft offenses. He was convicted of shoplifting on multiple occasions, but nothing in his California record suggested the full depth and breadth of his criminal history. The discovery that changed everything came in April 2010, when Naso's probation officer, conducting a routine compliance check at his home in Reno, Nevada, where Naso had relocated after financial difficulties forced him to leave California, found evidence that immediately elevated him from a minor theft offender to the subject of a major homicide investigation. Among the items discovered during the probation search were a diary in which Naso had written detailed accounts of sexual assaults he claimed to have committed, a handwritten list that investigators came to call the List of 10, a document containing the names of 10 women, alongside notations that strongly suggested these were records of victims, and an extraordinary collection of photographs that documented not only Naso's commercial work, but also images that were deeply disturbing in their content, and that suggested a long history of predatory behavior toward women. The diary and the List of 10 provided investigators with a roadmap into a criminal history far more extensive than anything they had previously suspected. An investigation that followed the Reno probation search rapidly expanded to encompass multiple jurisdictions and multiple potential victims across several states. Among the names on the list were 4 women whose deaths had been recorded as possible homicides in California: Roxine Ragash, found dead in Marin County in January 1977; Pamela Parsons, found dead in Yuba County in October 1993; Tracy DeFoya, found dead in Nevada County in November 1993; and John Doe Jane, an unidentified victim found in Sacramento County in April 1994. Investigators working through the evidence from Naso's home connected him to all 4 California deaths through a combination of the diary entries, the photographs, and DNA evidence that had been preserved from the original crime scenes, and that could now be compared against Naso's DNA profile. The DNA matches, combined with the documentary evidence found in his home, provided a foundation for charges that were filed in Marin County in 2010, marking the beginning of a legal process that would eventually result in one of the most unusual and in many ways one of the most disturbing trials in California legal history. The connection to the Rochester Alphabet murders emerged as part of the broader investigation into Naso's background and history, as investigators working the California charges began to examine his full biographical record and discover the geographic and temporal connections between his presence in Rochester in the early 1970s and the timing of the 3 double initial murders. DNA evidence recovered from the Rochester crime scenes was compared against Naso's DNA profile, and the results provided investigators with the scientific confirmation they had been seeking for nearly 4 decades. Joseph Naso, the the retired California photographer currently facing murder charges in Marin County, was the man who had killed Carmen Colon, Wanda Volkovich, and Michelle Maenza in the Rochester area between 1971 and 1973. The trial of Joseph Naso in Marin County Superior Court, which began in 2013, was remarkable for a number of reasons, not least of which was Naso's decision to represent himself, a decision that gave him direct access to the witnesses and evidence presented against him, and that resulted in a series of courtroom performances that were by turns bizarre, disturbing, and deeply revealing of the psychological profile that had driven his criminal behavior across decades. Naso, then 78 years old, conducted his own defense with a combination of genuine legal preparation. He had clearly studied the relevant law and procedure carefully, and a profound inability to conceal the contempt and arrogance that investigators and psychologists had identified as central features of his personality. He cross-examined witnesses, challenged forensic evidence, and delivered opening and closing statements that were, in the assessment of legal observers, simultaneously more competent than expected from a layperson and ultimately self-defeating in the ways they revealed his character to the jury. He showed no remorse, expressed no sympathy for the victims or their families, and presented himself throughout the proceedings with a kind of cold intellectual detachment that made the testimony about his crimes feel even more disturbing than it might otherwise have been. The prosecution presented an overwhelming case built on DNA evidence, the diary entries, the photographs found in his home, and testimony from investigators and forensic experts that traced the connections between Naso and each of his victims with methodical and devastating thoroughness. The jury, after considering the evidence, returned verdicts of guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder in the California cases, and in August 2013, Judge Mark Arnese sentenced Naso to death, a sentence that reflected both the severity of his crimes and the jury's assessment of his character and his lack of any apparent remorse. The resolution of the Alphabet murders through the DNA connection to Naso, while it came too late for families of Carmen Colon, Wanda Volkovich, and Michelle Maenza to experience the full measure of justice in a courtroom, nonetheless brought a form of closure that had seemed, for nearly 4 decades, entirely out of reach. The families of the 3 Rochester victims had lived for 38 years in the shadow of unresolved grief and unanswered questions. The knowledge of what had been done to their daughters, sisters, and nieces without any corresponding knowledge of who had done it or why. The identification of Naso as the perpetrator, while it could not undo any of that suffering, at least provided an answer to the question that had haunted them for so long, and allowed the official cold case files on Carmen Colon, Wanda Volkovich, and Michelle Maenza to be formally closed with a notation that the perpetrator had been identified. The Monroe County District Attorney's Office reviewed the DNA evidence connecting Naso to the Rochester murders and issued a public statement confirming the connection, though Naso was not separately prosecuted in New York given that he was already facing a death sentence in California, and that the resources required for a separate prosecution would not have produced a meaningfully different outcome in terms of the justice delivered. The families of the victims express a range of reactions to this resolution: relief, grief, anger at the decades of waiting, and in some cases a complicated ambivalence about whether the knowledge of the perpetrator's identity could ever truly compensate for the loss they had sustained and the years of uncertainty they had endured. Joseph Naso remained on California's death row following his conviction, continuing to file appeals and to pursue legal challenges to his conviction and sentence through the California court system. He died on death row on February 2nd, 2022, at the age of 88, never having expressed remorse for any of his crimes and never having provided investigators with a full account of his criminal history that might have allowed additional victims to be identified and additional families to receive the answers they deserved. His death closed a legal chapter of the Alphabet Murders case, but it left open questions that may never be fully resolved. Questions about the full extent of his criminal activity, about whether the 10 names on his list of 10 represented the complete universe of his victims or merely a portion of them, and about how many other crimes he may have committed during the decades he spent moving between New York and California with the confidence of a man who believed himself permanently beyond accountability. The case of the Alphabet murders and its eventual resolution through Joseph Naso's identification and conviction stands as one of the most significant cold case breakthroughs in the history of upstate New York criminal justice, and it carries lessons that extend far beyond its geographic boundaries. It is a reminder of the extraordinary value of preserving physical evidence from unsolved crimes, since the DNA that ultimately connected Naso to the Rochester murders had been collected from crime scenes in the early 1970s and maintained through nearly 4 decades of storage before it could be used in a way that ultimately mattered. It is a reminder of the danger of allowing a single investigative theory to dominate a cold case to the exclusion of other possibilities, since a prolonged focus on Kenneth Bianchi as a potential suspect, however understandable given the circumstances, consumed investigative attention that might otherwise have been directed toward the actual perpetrator. And it is, above all, a reminder of what is owed to 3 young girls from Rochester, Carmen Colon, Wanda Volkovich, and Michelle Manza, whose murders defined the community's fear for nearly 4 decades and whose memory deserved, from the very beginning, exactly the justice that was finally, belatedly, and imperfectly delivered when the man who killed them was identified, tried, convicted, and sentenced to die for what he had done. Number 6. The murder of Precious Doe, a case that began with the discovery of an unidentified child's remains and unraveled into one of the most heartbreaking revelations of parental betrayal in American criminal history. There are cases that begin with mystery and end with a truth so devastating, so fundamentally contrary to every instinct we have about the bonds between parents and children, that the resolution feels in some ways more disturbing than the mystery itself. The case of Precious Doe, the name given by investigators in the Kansas City community to an unidentified little girl whose decapitated body was discovered in a park in the spring of 2001, is precisely such a case. For nearly 4 years, the identity of the child remained unknown, her face reconstructed from her remains by forensic artists, her story told only through the physical evidence of the violence that had ended her life, while investigators and community members struggled with the knowledge that somewhere in the world there were people who knew who she was and had chosen to say nothing. When her identity was finally established in 2005, and when the full truth of what had happened to her and who was responsible emerged in the weeks and months that followed, the revelation hit the Kansas City community and the broader national audience that had followed the case, with the force of something genuinely and almost unbearably terrible. Erica Michelle Marie Green was 3 years old when she was murdered. The people responsible for her death were her own mother and stepfather, and the 4 years during which she lay unidentified in a Missouri grave, while her killers lived their lives in Oklahoma and Texas, represented not only a failure of justice, but a failure of every human system that should have protected her, a failure whose dimensions became clearer and more painful with every detail that emerged as investigators pieced together the full story of her short and brutally ended life. Erica Michelle Marie Green was born on October 2, 1997, in Newark, New Jersey, the daughter of Michelle Johnson, a young woman who would prove entirely unequal to the responsibilities of motherhood, and a biological father who was not significantly present in Erica's life. From the very beginning of her existence, Erica inhabited a world defined by instability, neglect, and the kind of chaotic domestic environment that child welfare systems are designed to identify and respond to, but that too often slips through the gaps in institutional oversight. Michelle Johnson was, by most accounts, a deeply troubled young woman whose own background included significant dysfunction and whose capacity for consistent, attentive, and protective parenting that a small child requires was severely compromised by her personal history and her choices. She became involved with a man named Harold Franklin Johnson, and it was this relationship and the dynamics it created in the household where Erica lived that would ultimately prove fatal for the little girl. Harold Johnson was violent, controlling, and possessed of a cruel streak toward the child that those who had observed the family later described in terms that suggested Erica's suffering had been visible to people around them even before her death. The family moved from New Jersey to Kansas City, Missouri, at some point in the period before Erica's death, a relocation that removed Erica from whatever limited social network might have provided some degree of oversight or intervention, and placed her in a new city where she was unknown, unregistered in any school or daycare system, and entirely dependent on the 2 adults in her household for everything: food, shelter, safety, and the basic human acknowledgement of her existence. The discovery that would set the investigation in motion took place on April 28, 2001, when a man walking in Finn Park, a small public park in a residential neighborhood in Kansas City, discovered what he initially took to be debris, but quickly recognized with horror as the decapitated torso of a small child. The responding officers from the Kansas City Police Department found the torso of a young girl, subsequently estimated to be between 3 and 5 years of age. Dressed in purple sweatpants and a floral shirt, her body showing evidence of significant physical trauma in addition to the decapitation. A search of the park and surrounding area located the child's severed head a short distance away, and the physical evidence suggested that the decapitation had occurred after death rather than as a cause of it, a detail that spoke to a level of deliberate mutilation designed, investigators believed, to complicate identification. The medical examiner determined that the child had died from blunt force trauma to the head, and the physical evidence of her body revealed signs of prior abuse, old injuries, evidence of chronic malnutrition, and physical markers consistent with a child who had been subjected to sustained mistreatment over an extended period before the final, fatal assault. The child had no identification, no personal effects that might have indicated who she was, and there were no missing persons reports in the Kansas City area or in the broader national database that matched her description, an absence that was, in itself, profoundly disturbing, since it suggested either that no one had reported her missing or that the people responsible for her death had ensured that no such report would be made. The effort to identify the child consumed an enormous amount of investigative resources and community attention in the weeks, months, and years that followed her discovery. The Kansas City Police Department worked with forensic artists to create a facial reconstruction, a detailed, lifelike rendering of what the child had looked like in life. And this image was distributed nationally and internationally through law enforcement channels, media outlets, and eventually the internet, where it reached millions of people and generated thousands of tips that investigators patiently followed up without success. The child was given the name Precious Doe by a local minister who felt strongly that the unnamed girl deserved a name that reflected her value as a human being rather than the anonymity of a case number, and this name was adopted widely by the community, the media, and eventually by investigators themselves, becoming the public identity of a child whose real name remained unknown. The Precious Doe case generated an extraordinary outpouring of community response in Kansas City. Candlelight vigils, memorial services, fundraising efforts for the investigation, and a sustained public advocacy campaign led by community members who refused to allow the case to fade from public attention in the way that cases involving unidentified victims sometimes do. Local ministers, community activists, and ordinary citizens maintained a sustained public presence around the case that kept it alive in the local consciousness, and that, investigators later acknowledged, played a meaningful role in the eventual breakthrough that led to Erica's identification. The identification of Precious Doe as Erica Michelle Marie Green came in May 2005, nearly 4 years after her body was discovered, and it came through a combination of investigative persistence, community advocacy, and the particular courage of an individual who finally decided that the truth could no longer be suppressed. A woman in Oklahoma came forward with information that she believed connected the unidentified child to a family she had known, providing investigators with a name, Erica Green, and a set of family connections that gave the investigation a completely new direction. Using dental records and DNA evidence, investigators were able to confirm with scientific certainty that the child found in Finn Park in April 2001 was indeed Erica Michelle Marie Green, born October 2, 1997, in Newark, New Jersey, 3 years old at the time of her death, a child who had been invisible to every system that should have known she existed and who had lain unidentified in a Missouri grave for nearly 4 years, while the people responsible for her death lived their lives in other states. The confirmation of Erica's identity was announced at a press conference in Kansas City that drew enormous media attention, and that provoked an immediate and intense public reaction. Grief for the child who had finally been given her real name back, outrage at the people who had killed her and concealed her identity, and a profound and searching set of questions about how a 3-year-old child could have fallen so completely through every gap in every system designed to protect children. The investigation that followed the identification of Erica Green moved rapidly toward the 2 individuals most directly responsible for her death. Michelle Johnson, Erica's biological mother, was located in Texas, where she had been living since the family's departure from Kansas City following Erica's death. Harold Franklin Johnson, Erica's stepfather, was located in Oklahoma. Both were taken into custody, and the investigation into their backgrounds and their accounts of what had happened to Erica produced a picture of the months preceding her death that was, in its detail, almost impossibly painful to confront. According to the accounts assembled by investigators from interviews, physical evidence, and the testimony of individuals who had known the family, Erica had been subjected to sustained physical abuse by Harold Johnson over an extended period, with Michelle Johnson either participating in or failing to prevent the abuse despite her awareness of it. The final assault that ended Erica's life had been carried out by Harold Johnson, who inflicted the fatal blunt force trauma to the child's head in an act of savage violence whose specific triggering circumstances were disputed, but whose outcome was never in doubt. Following Erica's death, the decision had been made, a decision that investigators believed was made jointly by Michelle and Harold Johnson, to dispose of the body in a manner designed to prevent identification, which was why Erica had been decapitated and her body left in a public park rather than buried or otherwise concealed. The choice to decapitate the body was a calculated act of deliberate cruelty toward a dead child, designed not out of any ritual or psychological compulsion, but out of the cold practical calculation that a decapitated body would be harder to identify than an intact one, a calculation that proved correct for nearly 4 years, and that represents one of the most disturbing aspects of a case already defined by disturbing choices. The question of why no one had reported Erica missing was one that haunted the investigation, and that produced answers as uncomfortable as the question itself. Erica had not been enrolled in school, had not been registered with any child welfare or social services agency in Kansas City, and had no apparent presence in any institutional record that might have triggered an inquiry into her whereabouts when she disappeared. She was, in the language that investigators and child welfare advocates use, an invisible child, a child whose existence was known only to her immediate family and the limited social circle around them, with no institutional footprint that would cause anyone in a position of authority to notice her absence. The family's mobility, moving from New Jersey to Kansas City and then out of Kansas City following her death, compounded this invisibility, since it meant that even the limited informal networks of neighbors and acquaintances who might have noticed Erica's absence in one location were disrupted before any sustained inquiry could develop. Several individuals who had known the family in Kansas City later acknowledged that they had concerns about Erica's welfare, that they had seen signs of the abuse she was suffering, but had not reported these concerns to authorities, a failure of community intervention that, while understandable in the context of the social dynamics that discouraged such reporting, nonetheless contributed to the outcome by leaving Erica without the outside intervention that might have saved her life. The case became, in the years following its resolution, a significant reference point in discussions of child welfare policy, mandatory reporting laws, and the systemic failures that allow children to become invisible to the institutions designed to protect them. The legal proceedings against Michelle Johnson and Harold Franklin Johnson were conducted in Jackson County Circuit Court in Missouri and were complicated by the evidentiary challenges inherent in a case where so much time had passed between the crime and the identification of the victim. The prosecution built its case on the forensic evidence from Erica's body, the DNA evidence confirming her identity, and the testimony of individuals who had known the family and could speak to the circumstances of Erica's life and death. Harold Franklin Johnson was charged with first-degree murder, and the evidence against him, including statements he had made that were inconsistent in ways that corroborated the prosecution's theory of what had happened, was sufficient to support conviction. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a sentence that, given the nature and circumstances of the crime, was received by the community and by advocates who had fought for Erica as the appropriate and necessary response to what he had done. Michelle Johnson's case was somewhat more complex from a legal standpoint, involving questions about the precise degree of her participation in Erica's death as opposed to her role in the subsequent concealment of the crime and the prevention of identification. She ultimately pleaded guilty to charges related to her role in the crime and was sentenced to 25 years in prison, a sentence that many advocates and community members felt was insufficient given the nature of her failure to protect her own daughter and her active participation in the effort to conceal Erica's identity, but one that represented the outcome that the prosecution was able to achieve given the legal complexities of the case. The resolution of the Precious Doe case sent ripples through the Kansas City community and through the broader national conversation about child welfare, invisible children, and the systemic failures that allow the most vulnerable members of society to fall through the gaps in the systems designed to protect them. The ministers, community activists, and ordinary citizens who had maintained public advocacy around the case for nearly 4 years and who had refused to allow Precious Doe to be forgotten experienced the resolution with a mixture of profound grief for Erica, Grief for the 4 years of waiting, grief for the impossibility of fully reckoning with what had been done to her, and a hard-won sense of vindication for the principle that no child, however invisible to institutional systems, was without advocates willing to fight for her. The Precious Doe Memorial Foundation, established in the wake of the case's resolution, continued to work on issues related to child welfare and the identification of unidentified children's remains, channeling the community's grief and outrage into advocacy that sought to ensure that other children in similar circumstances might receive protection and the justice that Erica did not receive in time to save her life. The case also had significant implications for law enforcement practices related to unidentified victims, contributing to improvements in the systems used to circulate images and information about unidentified remains and to the development of more effective protocols for connecting unidentified victims with missing persons reports. Erica Michelle Marie Green lived for 3 years, 2 months, and 26 days. She was, by every account, a small, bright child who deserved the same safety, love, and opportunity that every child deserves, and who received instead abuse, neglect, and a violent death at the hands of the two people most fundamentally obligated to protect her. Her body lay unidentified for nearly 4 years in a Kansas City grave, known only by the name a compassionate stranger had given her, while her killers lived freely in other states. The eventual identification of her remains, the arrest and conviction of those responsible for her death, and the extraordinary community advocacy that had kept her memory alive through 4 years of uncertainty represent a form of justice that is real but necessarily incomplete. Real because it named her killers, convicted them, and sentenced them to consequences proportionate to their crimes. Incomplete because no legal outcome could restore what was taken from Erica Green in a Kansas City apartment when she was 3 years old, and because the systems that should have protected her had failed her long before the night she died. Harold Franklin Johnson will die in a Missouri prison. Michelle Johnson will spend the better part of her remaining years incarcerated. And Erica Michelle Marie Green. Precious Doe, the little girl in the purple sweatpants found in Finn Park on a spring morning in 2001, will be remembered not only as a victim, but as a reason an entire community refused to look away, and as a permanent reminder of what we owe to the children who cannot yet speak for themselves. Number 7. The murder of Christine Jessup, a case that destroyed an innocent man's life for decades before genetic genealogy finally pointed to the real killer, a trusted family friend who had been dead for 5 years. There are cold cases that carry within them not one tragedy, but two: the tragedy of the original crime, and the tragedy of what the failure to solve that crime does to the innocent people caught in its shadow. The murder of Christine Jessup in Ontario, Canada, in 1984 is a case that embodies both of these dimensions with particular and devastating completeness. Christine was 9 years old when she was abducted and murdered in the small community of Queensville, Ontario, a crime so shocking in a region and an era when such violence felt genuinely unthinkable that it immediately became one of the most significant criminal cases in Canadian history. But the story of Christine Jessup's murder is inseparable from the story of Guy Paul Morin, the young man who lived next door to the Jessup family and who was arrested, tried, acquitted, retried, convicted, and ultimately exonerated through DNA evidence in one of the most catastrophic wrongful conviction cases in the history of Canadian jurisprudence. A man who spent years under the shadow of a murder charge and conviction for a crime he did not commit, whose life was irrevocably altered by the failures of the investigative and legal systems that were supposed to pursue truth and deliver justice. And it is also the story of Calvin Hoover, the man who actually committed the murder, a trusted family friend who had been welcomed into the Jessup home, who had attended Christine's funeral, who had watched as an innocent man was prosecuted for his crime, and who had taken the truth of what he had done to his grave in 2015, 5 years before genetic genealogy finally exposed him as a killer. The full story of Christine Jessup, her life, her death, the wrongful conviction it produced, and the posthumous identification of her actual killer, is one of the most complex, most painful, and most consequential true crime cases in Canadian history, and it demands to be understood in all of its dimensions rather than reduced to any single element of the extraordinary sequence of events that defines it. Christine Jessup was born on March 13, 1975, in Toronto, Ontario, the daughter of Robert and Janet Jessup, a working-class family that had settled in Queensville, a small rural community approximately 60 kilometers north of Toronto in York Region. Queensville in the early 1980s was a kind of small Canadian community where children played outside unsupervised, where neighbors knew each other well, and where the idea of a child being abducted and murdered felt as remote and unreal as something from a distant city or a foreign country. Christine was, by all accounts, a cheerful and energetic 9-year-old who loved music. She played the recorder, and who was deeply embedded in the social fabric of her small community, known to neighbors and classmates as a bright and lively presence whose disappearance would leave a hole in the community that never fully closed. She had an older brother, Kenny, and the family lived on a quiet street in Queensville where the Morin family were their immediate neighbors. Guy Paul Morin, then in his early 20s, lived with his parents next door to the Jessups, and the two families had a neighborly relationship that would become, in the aftermath of Christine's disappearance, the source of one of the most devastating miscarriages of justice in Canadian legal history. On October 3, 1984, Christine returned home from school in the afternoon and, for reasons that were never fully established, was alone in a family home for a period before her mother returned from work. She was last seen alive by a neighbor at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and when Janet Jessup arrived home later that day, Christine was gone. A search in the neighborhood and surrounding area failed to find her, and the investigation that followed her disappearance was characterized from an early stage by the kind of investigative tunnel vision that would ultimately send an innocent man to prison while her actual killer walked free. The investigation into Christine Jessup's disappearance was taken up by the Ontario Provincial Police, and it moved with what would later be recognized as deeply troubling speed toward a focus on Guy Paul Morin as the primary suspect. Morin was, in many ways, the kind of person that investigators of that era were inclined to view with suspicion. He was somewhat socially unconventional, kept to himself, had unusual hobbies, and did not respond to police questioning the ways that investigators expected or found reassuring. He played the clarinet, kept bees, and was described by some who knew him as eccentric, characteristics that are entirely consistent with being an ordinary, harmless person, and that are entirely inconsistent with any profile of a violent predator, but that nonetheless contributed to the investigative suspicion that attached to him in the early days of the inquiry. Morin was interviewed by police on multiple occasions, and the interviews themselves, as was later established through careful review, were conducted in ways that reflected a presumption of guilt rather than an open-minded inquiry, with investigators focusing on inconsistencies and behaviors that they interpreted as suspicious rather than pursuing the full range of possible perpetrators in the evidence-driven way that the investigation required. Christine's body was found on January 31st, 1985, in a field in Durham region, approximately 50 kilometers from Queensville, where she had been sexually assaulted and murdered. The discovery of her remains confirmed the worst fears of her family and community and set in motion the legal proceedings against Guy Paul Morin that would consume the next decade of his life and the next decade of Canadian legal history. Guy Paul Morin was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Christine Jessup in April 1985, and the first trial that followed his arrest produced a result that, in retrospect, should have prompted the most serious possible re-examination of the case against him. In January 1986, following a trial in which the prosecution presented what it characterized as a compelling circumstantial case, the jury acquitted Morin of first-degree murder, a verdict that reflected, at minimum, the jury's assessment that the evidence presented was insufficient to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In most cases, an acquittal represents the end of the legal proceedings against the acquitted individual. In the Morin case, the Crown successfully appealed the acquittal on the grounds of misdirection to the jury, and the Ontario Court of Appeal ordered a new trial, a decision that set in motion a second round of legal proceedings that would produce an outcome even more devastating for an innocent man than the first. The second trial of Guy Paul Morin began in 1992 and was, by any measure, one of the most significant criminal proceedings in Ontario legal history, a case that attracted enormous media attention, that engaged the full resources of the Crown Prosecution Service and the defense bar, and that ultimately produced a verdict that would be revealed, through subsequent DNA analysis, to be catastrophically wrong. In July 1992, Guy Paul Morin was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of Christine Jessup and sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years. He maintained his innocence throughout, insisted that he had not harmed Christine, and continued to assert, for within the prison system where he was now confined, that the legal process had failed him in the most fundamental way possible. The conviction of Guy Paul Morin prompted an extended period of advocacy by his legal team, his family, and the growing community of Canadian legal reformers who had been closely following the case and who had serious concerns about the reliability of the evidence on which the conviction rested. Among the most significant concerns was the reliability of testimony from jailhouse informants who had claimed that Morin had made incriminating statements while in custody, testimony of a type that has since been widely recognized as among the most unreliable and most easily fabricated forms of evidence in the criminal justice system. There were also serious concerns about the forensic evidence presented at trial and about the manner in which the investigation had been conducted from the very beginning, with investigators who had formed an early and apparently inflexible view of Morin's guilt and had pursued the case against him with a determination that left little room for the consideration of alternative suspects. The advocacy for Morin's exoneration gained significant momentum in the mid-1990s when advances in DNA technology created the possibility of re-examining biological evidence from Christine Jessup's case in ways that had not been available at the time of the original investigation. In 1995, DNA testing was conducted on biological evidence recovered from Christine's body and clothing, and the results were unambiguous and devastating for the prosecution's case. The DNA did not match Guy Paul Morin. The DNA profile derived from the crime scene evidence belonged to an unknown individual, not the man who had been convicted of the murder and who had spent years in prison for a crime the DNA evidence now clearly established he had not committed. Guy Paul Morin was formally exonerated on January 23, 1995, when the Ontario Court of Appeal overturned his conviction on the basis of the DNA evidence, and he was released from custody, a free man after years of imprisonment for a murder he had not committed, his life irrevocably altered by the failures of the investigative and legal systems that had pursued him with such misguided conviction. The exoneration was followed by a formal public inquiry, the Kaufman Commission, that examined the investigation and prosecution of Guy Paul Morin in exhaustive detail and produced a report released in 1998 that identified a series of significant failures in police investigation, forensic science, and prosecutorial conduct that had contributed to the wrongful conviction. The Kaufman Commission report became one of the most important documents in the history of Canadian criminal justice reform, cited repeatedly in subsequent discussions of wrongful convictions, tunnel vision in criminal investigations, the unreliability of jailhouse informant testimony, and the need for rigorous quality controls in forensic science. Morin received a financial settlement from the Ontario government in recognition of the harm done to him by the wrongful conviction, but no amount of financial compensation could fully address what had been taken from him: the years of imprisonment, the public association with a horrific crime he did not commit, and the permanent alteration of the trajectory of his life that resulted from the investigative and legal failures that had targeted him while Christine Jessup's actual killer remained entirely beyond suspicion. The DNA profile recovered from Christine Jessup's remains represented the key to identify her actual killer, and it sat in the databases of the Ontario Provincial Police for 25 years following Morin's exoneration, generating no matches despite periodic comparisons against the growing databases of convicted offenders. The breakthrough came through the application of genetic genealogy, the same revolutionary technique that had been used to identify the Golden State Killer in California, and it came in 2020, 36 years after Christine Jessup's murder. Investigators working the cold case partnered with genetic genealogist Barbara Ray Venner, whose work on the Golden State Killer case had established her as one of the foremost practitioners of investigative genetic genealogy, to upload the crime scene DNA profile to public genealogy databases and begin the painstaking process of building family trees from the partial matches that resulted. The process involved constructing and analyzing family trees that encompass hundreds of individuals across multiple generations, systematically narrowing the field of potential candidates through a combination of genealogical research, geographic analysis, and elimination of individuals whose age, location, or other characteristics made them unlikely matches for the crime scene DNA. The work took months, but eventually produced a result of extraordinary significance. The genetic genealogy analysis pointed to a man named Calvin Hoover as the most likely source of the DNA recovered from Christine Jessup's body and clothing. Calvin Hoover was not a stranger to the Jessup family. He was, in fact, a family friend, a man who had been known to Robert and Janet Jessup, who had been present in the community at the time of Christine's disappearance and murder, and who had, by all available accounts, conducted himself in the years following Christine's death in a manner that gave no outward indication of the secret he was carrying. He had attended Christine's funeral. He had lived in the community in the aftermath of the murder, as his neighbor's family was torn apart by grief, and as an innocent man was prosecuted, convicted, and imprisoned for the crime he had committed. He had subsequently moved away from the area and lived out the remainder of his life in relative obscurity, dying in London, Ontario, in 2015, 5 years before the genetic genealogy analysis that would posthumously expose him as Christine Jessup's killer. The identification of Hoover as the source of the crime scene DNA was confirmed through DNA samples collected from his surviving family members, which allowed investigators to establish with scientific certainty that the DNA recovered from Christine's body and clothing matched Calvin, Hoover's genetic profile. The Ontario Provincial Police announced the identification in November 2020, 36 years after Christine's murder, in a press conference that represented one of the most significant cold case resolutions in Canadian criminal justice history. The announcement that Calvin Hoover had been identified as Christine Jessup's killer produced a series of reactions that were as complex and as emotionally charged as the case itself. For the Jessup family, who had spent 36 years living with the knowledge of what had happened to Christine without knowing who was responsible, the identification of Hoover brought a form of closure that was real but deeply bittersweet. The answer to the question they had been asking for decades, delivered too late for the man responsible to face any legal consequence for what he had done. For Guy Paul Morin, the identification of the actual perpetrator represented a final and complete vindication of everything he had maintained throughout the years of his wrongful prosecution and imprisonment. Confirmation, at the level of scientific certainty, that he had told the truth all along and that the systems that had failed him had done so not because the truth was ambiguous, but because they had been unwilling or unable to pursue it with the objectivity and rigor that justice required. Morin spoke publicly following the announcement, expressing relief at the final resolution, while also acknowledging the complicated emotions that the identification of Hoover produced. A man who had known Christine, who had been trusted by her family, whose presence at her funeral and in her community in the aftermath of her death represented a dimension of cold-blooded calculation that made the crime feel, if anything, even more disturbing than it had before his identity was known. For Robert Jessup, Christine's father, the announcement came too late. He had died in 2004 without knowing who had killed his daughter, one of the many human costs of the 36-year delay in resolving the case. Janet Jessup, Christine's mother, was alive to hear the announcement and spoke publicly about the relief and grief that the identification of Hoover produced in equal measure. The case of Christine Jessup and its resolution through genetic genealogy carries implications that extend across multiple domains of criminal justice practice and policy. The successful application of genetic genealogy to a 36-year-old Canadian cold case demonstrated that the technique was not limited to American jurisdictions and was capable of producing results in cases where the DNA evidence was decades old and where the original investigation had proceeded without the benefit of modern forensic technology. The case also reinforced, with particular force, the lessons that the wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Morin had already contributed to Canadian criminal justice reform. Lessons about the dangers of investigative tunnel vision, the unreliability of certain categories of evidence, and the fundamental importance of maintaining rigorous standards of objectivity in criminal investigations regardless of the pressure to produce results. The identification of Calvin Hoover as the actual perpetrator, while it could not undo any of the harm that the wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Morin had caused, provided a final and definitive answer to the question that had underlain every aspect of the Morin case from the very beginning. If he did not do it, who did? And in doing so, it completed the process of accountability that the original investigation had so catastrophically failed to pursue. Christine Jessup, who was 9 years old when she was murdered by a man her family trusted, deserved from the very beginning an investigation that followed the evidence wherever it led rather than wherever investigative assumptions pointed. The truth about who killed her arrived 36 years late, carried on the back of scientific technique that did not exist when she died, delivered to a family that had waited longer than any family should have to wait, and revealing a perpetrator who had lived freely for 31 years before dying with a secret apparently intact, only to find, 5 years after his death, that the secret had not survived him after all. Number 8. The murder of Lyndon O'Keefe, a case that haunted an entire Southern California community, for 45 years before a DNA genealogy breakthrough finally delivered justice for an 11-year-old girl who had simply been walking home from school. There are cold cases that endure not only because they remain unsolved, but because of the particular quality of the innocence that was destroyed in the commission of the crime. Cases where the victim's vulnerability, the ordinariness of the circumstances in which they were taken, and the completeness of the devastation visited upon their family combine to create a wound in the community's consciousness that refuses to close regardless of how many years pass. The murder of Linda and O'Keefe in Newport Beach, California, on June 26, 1973, is precisely this kind of case. Linda was 11 years old, walking home from school on the last day of the academic year, a day that should have been a celebration, the beginning of summer, the particular freedom that children feel when the school year ends and the long, warm months stretch out ahead, when she was abducted from a street in broad daylight in one of Orange County's most affluent and ostensibly safe communities. Her body was found hours later in a canyon several miles from where she had last been seen, and the investigation that followed her murder was one of the most extensive in Orange County history, eventually encompassing thousands of leads, hundreds of suspects, and decades of periodic re-examination as new investigative tools and techniques became available. For 45 years, the identity of her killer remained unknown, a mystery that haunted the detectives who had worked the case, the community that had known and loved Linda, and the family that had spent nearly half a century without the answer they deserved. When the answer finally came, it came through the same revolutionary genetic genealogy technology that had solved the Golden State Killer case, and it led investigators to a man named Richard DeMoto Thompson, a man who had lived in Southern California at the time of the murder, and who had subsequently spent decades moving through the world carrying the knowledge of what he'd done, while Linda O'Keefe's family lived in the shadow of an unanswered question that no amount of time could make less painful. Linda O'Keefe was born on August 1st, 1961, in Orange County, California, the daughter of Thomas and Barbara O'Keefe, a family living in the coastal community of Newport Beach during one of the most prosperous and apparently tranquil periods in Southern California's history. Newport Beach in the early 1970s was a community defined by its proximity to the Pacific Ocean, its affluent residential neighborhoods, and the kind of suburban safety that made it seem, to the families who lived there, like an ideal environment in which to raise children. The O'Keefe family was well established in the community, and Linda was, by every account from those who knew her, a bright, cheerful, and deeply loved 11-year-old whose life was defined by the ordinary pleasures and ambitions of a child growing up in coastal California. School, friendships, the beach, the particular joy of summer approaching. She was the kind of child whose absence from a community is felt immediately and completely, whose loss leaves a hole that the community recognizes as irreplaceable, and whose murder produces not only grief, but a kind of collective disorientation. The sudden, terrible recognition that the safety that seemed so solid and so real was in fact fragile in ways that no one had fully acknowledged. On June 26, 1973, the last day of the school year at Ensign Intermediate School, Linda O'Keefe attended school, said goodbye to her classmates and teachers at the end of the day with a particular lightness that accompanies the beginning of summer vacation, and began walking home along a route she had traveled many times before. Somewhere along that route, in broad daylight in a residential neighborhood of one of California's most affluent coastal communities, she was abducted by a man who was unknown to her and who took her from the street with speed and efficiency that left no witnesses capable of providing a description sufficient to identify him. Her body was found later that day in a canyon in the Corona Del Mar area of Newport Beach, approximately 4 miles from where she had last been seen alive, and the medical examination confirmed that she had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The investigation that followed Linda O'Keefe's murder was immediately recognized as one of the most serious and most challenging criminal investigations in Orange County history, and it was pursued with the full resources of the Newport Beach Police Department and the Orange County Sheriff's Department over the weeks, months, and years that followed. The crime had occurred in a public place in daylight, which meant that the potential for witness information was significant, and investigators canvassed the neighborhood extensively in the days after murder, interviewing hundreds of residents, business owners, and passers-by in an effort to identify anyone who might have seen Linda in the period before her abduction, or might have observed a vehicle or individual acting suspiciously in the area. The canvas generated a number of leads and descriptions, but none that could be definitively connected to the perpetrator. An investigation gradually broadened to encompass a wider range of potential suspects, including registered sex offenders in the area, individuals with prior convictions for crimes against children, and others who came to investigators' attention through tips and referrals. The physical evidence recovered from Linda's body was carefully preserved and cataloged, a decision that would prove to be of extraordinary importance 45 years later. But at the time, it could not be matched to any identified suspect, and the case entered the long, painful limbo of an active but unproductive cold case investigation. Over the decades that followed, the Newport Beach Police Department periodically revisited the Linda O'Keefe case as new forensic technologies and investigative techniques became available. DNA technology, which emerged as a powerful investigative tool in the late 1980s and 1990s, allowed investigators to extract and profile the biological evidence preserved from the original crime scene, generating a DNA profile of the perpetrator that was entered into the Cody's national database and compared against a growing collection of convicted offender profiles without producing a match. The absence of a Cody's match confirmed that the perpetrator either had not been convicted of a qualifying offense after the database was established or had somehow avoided having his DNA collected despite any subsequent criminal history. And it meant that the resolution of the case would require either a direct identification of the suspect or the application of a more powerful genetic analysis tool capable of identifying relatives of the perpetrator even in the absence of the perpetrator's own profile in the database. The development of investigative genetic genealogy as a mainstream law enforcement tool following its successful application in the Golden State Killer case in 2018 provided exactly this kind of more powerful tool, and investigators working the Linda O'Keefe cold case moved relatively quickly to apply the technique once it became available and once the legal and policy frameworks governing its use had been established in California. The Orange County District Attorney's Office and the Newport Beach Police Department partnered with genetic genealogists to upload the perpetrator's DNA profile to public genealogy databases and begin the process of building family trees from the partial matches that resulted. The genetic genealogy investigation into the Linda O'Keefe case was painstaking and required the construction and analysis of multiple complex family trees before it began to converge on a specific candidate. The process involved identifying individuals in the public genealogy databases whose DNA profiles showed partial matches with the perpetrator's profile, indicating a shared ancestor rather than direct match, and then building out their family trees to identify the common ancestor and work forward through subsequent generations to identify individuals in the appropriate age range and geographic location who might have been in Newport Beach in June 1973. This process of progressive narrowing, which can take months and requires both genealogical expertise and careful investigative analysis, eventually pointed investigators toward a man named Richard DeMoto Thompson, a former Southern California resident who had been in the area at the time of the murder and whose age and background were consistent with the investigative profile developed over the course of the decades-long investigation. Thompson was located by investigators, and the collection of a DNA sample from him, accomplished through the same kind of covert recovery of discarded material that had been used in the Golden State Killer investigation, provided the scientific confirmation that the genetic genealogy analysis had suggested. The DNA recovered from Thompson matched the DNA profile derived from the biological evidence preserved from Linda O'Keefe's body with a statistical certainty that definitively identified him as her killer. Richard DeMoto Thompson was arrested in 2018, 45 years after the murder of Linda O'Keefe, and the news of his arrest sent shockwaves through the Newport Beach community and through the broader Orange County true crime community that had followed the case for decades. Richard DeMoto Thompson was, at the time of his arrest, an elderly man whose life in the decades since Linda O'Keefe's murder had taken him away from Southern California and eventually to a location in another state where he had lived without apparent detection. The details of his life between the 1973 murder and his 2018 arrest were examined carefully by investigators seeking to understand both the full scope of his criminal history and the circumstances of his life that had allowed him to evade identification for so long. Thompson had no prior convictions in the Cody's database, which explained the absence of a match during the years when investigators had been relying solely on the national database for comparison purposes, and his subsequent life had apparently been conducted without the kind of criminal activity that would have brought him to law enforcement's attention in a way that might have eventually connected him to the 1973 murder. He was, in this respect, similar to many of the perpetrators identified through genetic genealogy investigations, individuals who had committed crimes in an earlier era before DNA technology existed, and who had subsequently lived quietly without the violent recidivism that might have generated the law enforcement contact necessary to produce a Cody's match. The arrest of Thompson demonstrated, as the Golden State Killer case had demonstrated before it, and as the Christine Jessup case would demonstrate afterward, that the application of genetic genealogy to cold case investigations was capable of identifying perpetrators who had successfully evaded identification through every previously available investigative method, that the technique represented not merely an incremental improvement in cold case investigation, but a genuinely transformative capability that was fundamentally changing what was possible in cases that had previously seemed permanently beyond resolution. The legal proceedings against Richard DeMoto Thompson in Orange County Superior Court were complicated by the passage of time and by Thompson's age and health at the time of his arrest, factors that influenced both the pace of the proceedings and the ultimate resolution of the case. Thompson was charged with the murder of Linda and O'Keefe, and the prosecution's case rested primarily on the DNA evidence. The biological evidence preserved from the 1973 crime scene, and a match to Thompson's DNA profile that had been established through both the genetic genealogy analysis and the direct DNA comparison following his identification. The defense raised challenges to the DNA evidence and other aspects of the prosecution's case, as defense attorneys are obligated to do in any criminal proceeding, but the scientific certainty of the DNA match made the core of the prosecution's case essentially unassailable. Thompson ultimately pleaded guilty to the murder of Linda and O'Keefe, a plea that, while it spared the O'Keefe family the additional trauma of a full trial, also meant that the full account of what Thompson had done on June 26, 1973, the circumstances of the abduction, the details of what Linda had experienced in the hours before her death, the precise sequence of events that had brought Thompson to that street on that day, was never fully explored in a public courtroom in a way that a trial might have compelled. In 2021, Richard DeMoto Thompson was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, a sentence that, given his age at the time of sentencing, amounted in practical terms to a life sentence, a recognition that the crime he had committed, however long ago, demanded a consequence proportionate to its gravity and to the decades of suffering it had caused. The sentencing hearing in the Linda O'Keefe case was, like the sentencing hearings in the Golden State Killer case, and others resolved through genetic genealogy, a deeply emotional proceeding that brought together the legal resolution of a criminal case with the human reckoning that such resolutions demand. Members of the O'Keefe family, some of whom had waited their entire adult lives for this moment, delivered victim impact statements that described the lifelong consequences of Linda's murder, the decades of grief, the persistent absence of a sister and daughter who should have grown up and grown old alongside her family, the particular pain of an unanswered question that had shadowed every birthday and every anniversary and every occasion that Linda should have been present to share. The statements were a testament to the enduring human cost of violent crime and to particular cruelty of crimes that are not resolved quickly, the way in which the absence of accountability compounds the original loss, stretching across decades and generations and making the wound deeper and wider than it would otherwise have been. The investigators who had worked the case over the years, some of whom had devoted significant portions of their careers to trying to identify Linda's killer and who had lived to see the resolution they had worked toward, were also present at the hearing, bearing witness to the conclusion of an investigation that had defined a significant part of their professional lives. The Newport Beach Police Department issued statements acknowledging the significance of the resolution and expressing the department's gratitude to the genetic genealogists and forensic scientists whose work had made it possible. The case of Linda and O'Keefe and its resolution through genetic genealogy is significant in ways that extend well beyond the individual crime and its eventual accountability. It is one of the earliest and most prominent examples of genetic genealogy being applied to a decades-old cold case involving a child victim, and its success helped establish the technique as a standard tool in cold case investigations involving preserved biological evidence from historical crime scenes. The case also contributed to the broader legal and policy discussions about the appropriate use of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations. Discussions about privacy, consent, and the rights of individuals whose relatives have voluntarily submitted DNA to genealogy databases without necessarily understanding that law enforcement might use those databases to identify criminal suspects. These discussions have produced a patchwork of policies across different jurisdictions and different genealogy database operators, and they continue to evolve as the technique becomes more widely used and as its implications for genetic privacy become more fully understood. For the broader true crime community and for the investigators who work cold cases across the country, the O'Keefe resolution served as a powerful demonstration of the principle that the development of new investigative tools does not merely make new cases easier to solve. It makes old cases newly solvable, reopening doors that had seemed permanently closed and offering the possibility of justice to families who had long since given up hope of ever receiving it. Linda and O'Keefe walked home from school on June 26, 1973. On the last day of the school year, carry with her the ordinary joy of summer beginning and the reasonable expectation of safety that every child in a residential neighborhood deserves. She was 11 years old, and she deserved to grow up, to live the full life that was in front of her, to become the adult that her family knew and loved was contained within her. Richard DeMoto Thompson took all of that from her family, and from a community that had known and loved her, and he spent 45 years living freely with the knowledge of what he had done, while the O'Keefe family lived with the knowledge of what had been done to Linda and without the knowledge of who had done it. The DNA evidence that finally exposed him, preserved through 4.5 decades of careful evidence management and unlocked through the revolutionary technique of genetic genealogy, delivered a justice that was real, meaningful, and profoundly overdue. It arrived too late for Thomas O'Keefe, Linda's father, who did not live to see it. It arrived too late for the years of Linda's life that were stolen before they could be lived. But it arrived finally, with a certainty and a completeness that affirmed the principle that the passage of time, however long, does not extinguish the obligation to pursue truth and deliver accountability for crimes that have gone unanswered, that Linda and O'Keefe, like every victim of violent crime, deserved to have her killer named, charged, convicted, and sentenced, however many years it took to make that happen. Number 9. The murder of Carolyn Wasilewski, a case that went cold for more than 4 decades before DNA technology finally identified the man responsible for the rape and murder of a 14-year-old girl, a man who had died before he could ever face justice in courtroom. There are cold cases whose resolution brings with a particular and uniquely painful form of incompleteness. Cases where the identification of the perpetrator comes too late, not only in the sense that decades have passed since the crime was committed, but in the more immediate and more frustrating sense that the perpetrator himself has died before investigators were able to bring him to account, leaving behind a resolution that is scientifically certain and legally definitive, but that can never produce the courtroom reckoning, the public accountability, and the formal sentencing that victims and their families deserve, and that the justice system is designed to deliver. The murder of Carolyn Wasilewski in Baltimore County, Maryland, in 1974 is precisely this kind of case, a crime of extraordinary brutality committed against a 14-year-old girl, investigated with enormous effort over more than 4 decades, finally resolved through DNA analysis that identified the perpetrator with scientific certainty, and then closed without a trial, without a conviction, and without a sentence, because the man whose DNA matched the evidence from the crime scene had died, years before investigators were able to connect his name to the case. It is a story that illustrates both the extraordinary power of modern forensic science to reach across decades and deliver answers, and the fundamental limitations of a justice system that can only hold living defendants accountable. A story that leaves the families of victims like Carolyn Wasilewski with the truth they sought, but without the full measure of justice that truth should have delivered. Carolyn and Wasilewski was born in 1959 and grew up in the Baltimore County area of Maryland, a working-class community on the outskirts of Baltimore City, where families like hers had put down roots in the post-war decades and built lives defined by neighborhood ties, community institutions, and the modest but genuine security of steady employment and stable housing. Baltimore County in the early 1970s was a region in transition, its older working-class neighborhoods experiencing the social and economic pressures that were reshaping American cities and their suburbs during this period, but it retained much of the character of the close-knit community it had been for generations, a place where people knew their neighbors, where children moved through their neighborhoods with a degree of independence that subsequent generations would find difficult too. Imagine. And where the idea of a 14-year-old girl being abducted and murdered felt genuinely shocking rather than merely tragic. Carolyn was, by all accounts from those who knew her, a typical 14-year-old navigating the ordinary challenges and pleasures of early adolescence, school friendships, the particular intensity of feeling that characterizes the early teenage years. Without any indication that she was in danger or that the world she moved through contained a threat of the specific and lethal kind that would end her life in the autumn of 1974. She was reported missing by her family after failing to return home on October 31st, 1974, a date whose association with Halloween, a night when children and teenagers across America were moving through their neighborhoods in costumes, when the ordinary patterns of evening movement were disrupted and the darkness felt both festive and, in retrospect, foreboding, added an additional layer of particular sadness to the circumstances of her disappearance. The discovery of Carolyn Wasilewski's body in a wooded area of Baltimore County confirmed the worst fears of her family and set in motion one of the most sustained cold case investigations in Maryland history. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled, crimes of personal violence that required physical proximity between the victim and her killer, and that therefore generated biological evidence. Evidence that in 1974 could be analyzed using the forensic techniques available at the time, but that could not be matched to a specific individual without a suspect for comparison. The investigation proceeded with the tools and methods available in the mid-1970s, involving extensive canvassing of the neighborhoods where Carolyn had last been seen, interviews with individuals who might have had contact with her in the period before her disappearance, and the development and pursuit of leads generated through the investigation and through public tips. The investigation generated a number of suspects over the years who were examined and eliminated, but it failed to produce a definitive identification of the perpetrator. And after the initial intensity of the investigation subsided without a resolution, the case entered the long and painful limbo of an active cold case, maintained in the files of the Baltimore County Police Department, periodically revisited as new information or new techniques became available, but fundamentally unresolved, and increasingly remote from the kind of active investigative attention that might produce a breakthrough. The Baltimore County Police Department's Cold Case Unit, established in recognition of the significant backlog of unresolved homicide cases in the county, took up the Carolyn Wasilewski case as part of its broader mandate to apply modern forensic technology to historical crimes. The biological evidence preserved from the 1974 crime scene was submitted for DNA analysis, and investigators were able to extract and profile the perpetrator's DNA from evidence that had been maintained through more than 4 decades of storage, a testament to the importance of proper evidence preservation and to the foresight of the original investigators who had ensured that the physical evidence from the crime scene was cataloged and stored in a manner that preserved its forensic value across the decades. The DNA profile generated from the crime scene evidence was entered into the CODI's national database and compared against a growing collection of convicted offender profiles, but the search produced no immediate match, meaning that the perpetrator, whoever he was, had either not been convicted of a qualifying offense after CODI's was established or had somehow avoided having his DNA collected despite any subsequent criminal history. The absence of a CODI's match was disappointing but not definitive, and investigators continued to pursue the case through other means while also monitoring the database for any new matches that might emerge as additional profiles were added. The breakthrough in the Carolyn Wasilewski case came not through a CODI's match, but through a more targeted DNA investigation that involved comparing the crime scene DNA against profiles developed from other investigative sources. In 2016, investigators working the cold case obtained DNA from a suspect identified through the investigation, a man named Russell Weaver, who had come to investigators' attention through a combination of circumstantial information and investigative leads developed over the course of the cold case review. The comparison of Weaver's DNA against the crime scene profile produced a match that was scientifically certain, definitively identifying Weaver as the man whose biological material had been recovered from Carolyn Wasilewski's body more than 4 decades earlier. The identification was a moment of genuine investigative breakthrough, the culmination of more than 40 years of investigative effort, the answer to the question that had haunted the case since 1974, and the confirmation that the biological evidence preserved from the original crime scene had retained its evidentiary value across 4 decades of storage and was capable, when compared against the right profile, of identifying the perpetrator with absolute scientific certainty. But the breakthrough was immediately shadowed by a discovery that transformed the resolution from a moment of unambiguous triumph into something far more complicated and far more painful for the family of Carolyn Wasilewski. Russell Weaver was dead. He had died before investigators were able to identify him as the source of the crime scene DNA, meaning that the scientific identification of the perpetrator, the answer to the question of who had killed Carolyn Wasilewski, had arrived too late to result in an arrest, a trial, a conviction, or a sentence. Weaver had lived out his life after the murder, died without ever having been charged with Carolyn's killing, and was beyond the reach of any legal consequence at the moment his identity as her killer was scientifically established. The Baltimore County Police Department conducted a thorough investigation into Weaver's background and history in the wake of the DNA identification, seeking to understand who he was, what his connection to Carolyn Wasilewski might have been, whether there was any prior relationship between them, or whether the encounter that ended in her murder had been opportunistic, and whether there was any evidence suggesting that he had committed other crimes that had gone undetected or unresolved. The investigation into Weaver's background produced a profile of a man whose life had contained elements that, in retrospect, were consistent with the commission of the kind of crime for which his DNA had now identified him, but who had never been formally charged or convicted in connection with Carolyn's murder or, apparently, in connection with any other offense that had resulted in his DNA being collected for comparison purposes. The decision of how to handle the identification of a deceased perpetrator in a cold case homicide is one that law enforcement agencies approach in different ways, and the Baltimore County Police Department's response to the Weaver identification reflected a careful consideration of what was owed to Carolyn Wasilewski's family and to the broader community interest in transparency about the resolution of a significant cold case. The department made the decision to publicly announce the identification of Weaver as Carolyn's killer, a decision that served multiple purposes, including informing the public of the resolution of a long-standing cold case, providing the Wasilewski family with the official confirmation of the identity of their daughter's killer, and creating a public record of the finding that could serve as a reference point for any future investigations that might connect Weaver to other unsolved crimes. The announcement was made with appropriate caveats acknowledging that Weaver had died before being charged and that the identification was based on DNA evidence rather than on a judicial finding of guilt, distinctions that are legally significant even when the scientific evidence is essentially conclusive. The case was officially closed following the announcement, with a notation in the investigative record that the perpetrator had been identified through DNA analysis and that the case was being closed due to the death of the identified suspect. The reaction of Carolyn Wasilewski's family to the identification of Russell Weaver as her killer was one of profound and complicated grief. The relief of finally having an answer to the question that had haunted them for more than 4 decades, the anger and frustration of knowing that the man responsible had died without facing any legal consequence for what he had done, and the bittersweet recognition that the DNA evidence that had finally provided the answer had arrived too late to deliver the full justice that Carolyn deserved. Family members who spoke publicly in the aftermath of the announcement expressed these mixed feelings with a clarity and an emotional honesty that was deeply moving to those who followed the case, acknowledging that the identification of Weaver, while it could never undo the harm that had been done or deliver the courtroom accountability that should have followed his crime, at least provided the answer they had been seeking and allowed them to close a chapter of uncertainty that had defined their relationship to Carolyn's memory for more than 40 years. The absence of a trial meant that the full account of what Weaver had done and why, the circumstances of the crime, the details of what Carolyn had experienced, the specific facts that a trial would have established in the public record, remained incomplete, a gap that added to the family's grief, and that represented one of the most significant costs of resolution that came too late to hold the perpetrator fully accountable. The case of Carolyn Wasilewski and its resolution through DNA identification of a deceased perpetrator is representative of a category of cold case outcomes that has become increasingly common as forensic technology catches up with the backlog of unresolved historical crimes. The improvement in DNA extraction techniques, the expansion of comparison databases, and the development of genetic genealogy as an investigative tool have collectively made it possible to identify the perpetrators of decades-old crimes at a rate that would have seemed impossible even 20 years ago. But this increased identification capability has also produced a significant number of cases where the identified perpetrator has died before investigators can act on the identification. These posthumous identifications present law enforcement, prosecutors, and the justice system with a set of challenges that the existing legal framework was not specifically designed to address. Questions about how to handle findings of perpetrator identity that cannot be tested in a courtroom, how to communicate those findings to victims' families and to the public, and how to create a meaningful public record of the resolution that acknowledges both the scientific certainty of the identification and the absence of the judicial process that would normally be required to establish guilt formally and officially. Different jurisdictions have approached these challenges in different ways, and the absence of consistent national framework for handling posthumous perpetrator identifications represents a gap in the justice system's response to the cold case revolution that modern forensic technology has produced. The Baltimore County Cold Case Unit, which worked the Carolyn Wasilewski case through to its resolution, continued its work on other unresolved historical homicides in the county, applying the same combination of preserved biological evidence, modern DNA analysis, and investigative persistence that had produced the identification in the Wasilewski case to other cases that had been waiting for similar breakthroughs. The unit's work on the Wasilewski case was cited in subsequent discussions of cold case investigation methodology as an example of the importance of maintaining rigorous evidence preservation standards across decades. Since the resolution of the case depended entirely on the availability of biological evidence that had been collected and stored in 1974, and that retained its forensic value more than 40 years later. The case also contributed to the broader professional conversation about the appropriate allocation of investigative resources to cold cases. The argument that the investment required to maintain cold case units and to periodically revisit unresolved historical crimes is justified not only by the possibility of achieving justice in individual cases, but by the broader social value of demonstrating to victims and their families that the passage of time does not extinguish the obligation to pursue accountability. Carolyn Wasilewski was 14 years old when she was murdered on Halloween night in 1974, a child whose life was ended before it had truly begun, whose family was left with a wound that never fully healed, and whose case remained unresolved for 42 years before the DNA identification of Russell Weaver finally provided the answer that had been waiting since the autumn of the year her body was found in a wooded area of Baltimore County. The resolution of the case was real and meaningful. The identification of the perpetrator, the official closure of a file that had been open for more than 4 decades, the confirmation for the Wasilewski family that the biological evidence from the crime scene had survived and had been successfully used to identify the man responsible. But it was also profoundly and unavoidably incomplete. A resolution without a trial, an identification without an arrest, a finding of perpetrator identity without the formal judicial process that should have followed, a truth delivered too late to produce the full accountability that Carolyn deserved and that her family had waited 42 years to see. Russell Weaver died without facing any legal consequence for murdering a 14-year-old girl in Baltimore County in 1974, and while the DNA evidence that identified him ensured that his name was permanently attached to his crime in the public record, it could not deliver the experience of justice, the trial, the conviction, the sentence, the public reckoning that Carolyn Wasilewski's life demanded, and that the failures of the original investigation, compounded by the passage of time and the death of the perpetrator, ultimately made impossible to provide. Number 10. The murder of Sharon Matthews, a case that began with father's late-night phone call to police and unraveled into a story of abuse, deception, and the murder of a 3-year-old girl whose adoptive family had brought her to America from India with promises of a better life. There are cases that begin with a lie, a carefully constructed, deliberately maintained lie designed to redirect the attention of investigators away from the truth and toward a narrative that protects the guilty while betraying the innocent, and that unravel piece by piece as the weight of physical evidence and the persistence of determined investigators gradually dismantles the fiction that was erected in place of the truth. The case of Sharon Matthews in Richardson, Texas, is exactly this kind of case, and it is one that carries within it dimensions of tragedy that compound and deepen the further one examines them. Sharon was 3 years old, a child who had been born in India and adopted by a Texas family who had represented themselves as capable and committed parents, a family that had, in the eyes of the agencies and systems that oversaw the adoption process, passed the scrutiny necessary to be entrusted with the care and upbringing of a vulnerable child. She had come to America with all the promise and possibility that such a journey implies, and she had been placed in a home that should have been the beginning of a safe and stable life rather than the setting for the abuse and neglect that would end it. When Wesley Matthews, her adoptive father, called the Richardson Police Department at approximately 4 o'clock in the morning on October 7th, 2017, to report that his 3-year-old daughter had gone missing after he had left her alone outside as a punishment for not drinking her milk. The account he provided was so implausible, so immediately suspicious, and so fundamentally inconsistent with the physical and practical realities of the situation that investigators recognized almost from the first moment that they were not dealing with a missing child case, but with something far darker and far more deliberately concealed. The story of Sharon Matthews, her short life, her death, the lies told conceal it, and the deeply inadequate legal resolution that ultimately followed, is a story about the failure of multiple systems that should have protected her, about the particular vulnerability of internationally adopted children, and about the devastating consequences when the adults entrusted with child's care choose their own interests over the life of the child in their keeping. Sharon Matthews was born in India in 2014, the daughter of parents who were unable to care for her, and she spent her earliest years in an orphanage before being adopted by Wesley Matthews and his wife, Sydney Matthews, a couple of Indian origin living in Richardson, Texas, a suburban community in the Dallas metropolitan area. The adoption was arranged through legal channels and was subject to the standard oversight processes that govern international adoptions, including home studies and assessments designed to evaluate the suitability of prospective adoptive parents. Wesley and Sydney Matthews appeared, on the surface of these assessments, to be suitable adoptive parents. They were employed, financially stable, and presented themselves as committed to providing Sharon with a stable family environment she had not had in her early life. They already had a biological daughter, and Sharon was brought into the household as a second child, in addition to a family that appeared, from the outside, to be functioning normally. The reality of Sharon's life in the Matthews household, however, was something quite different from what the adoption process had suggested it would be, and the details that emerged in the investigation following her death painted a picture of a child who had been subjected to treatment that fell far short of the basic standards of care that any child deserves and that were specifically required by the legal and ethical obligations that came with the decision to adopt. Sharon was a small child, described by those who had seen her as a quiet and gentle little girl, and she had arrived in America as a toddler who, in common with many children adopted from institutional care settings, had developmental challenges and adjustment difficulties that required patient and attentive parenting. She had difficulty eating, which was a source of significant friction in the household, and which became a central element in the narrative of the events that led to her death. The details that investigators assembled in the weeks and months following the report of her disappearance suggested that Sharon's eating difficulties had been met not with the patience and professional support that developmental challenges in adopted children require, but with punishment. Punishment that, in the account Wesley Matthews eventually provided to investigators, had included the practice of taking Sharon outside in the middle of the night and leaving her alone in the darkness as a consequence for refusing to drink her milk. This account, which Matthews offered as an explanation for the circumstances of her disappearance, was received by investigators and by the broader public with a combination of immediate skepticism and profound horror. Skepticism because the account was internally inconsistent and practically implausible in multiple respects, and horror because, even if taken at face value, it described a form of punishment so inappropriate, so dangerous, and so fundamentally contrary to the basic obligations of parental care that it represented a serious failure of the duty of protection that every parent owes to every child. The events of the early morning hours of October 7th, 2017, as reconstructed by investigators from the physical evidence, witness accounts, and the eventually evolving statements of Wesley and Sydney Matthews, began sometime after midnight when Wesley Matthews was alone with Sharon in the Matthews family home in Richardson. Sydney Matthews and the couple's biological daughter were not present in the home at the time, a fact that was significant in establishing the circumstances of whatever happened to Sharon. At some point during those early morning hours, something occurred in the Matthews home that resulted in Sharon's death. something that Wesley Matthews was initially unwilling to disclose, and that he attempted to conceal through a sequence of actions and statements designed to redirect investigators toward the narrative of a missing child rather than the truth of what had actually happened. His call to the Richardson Police Department at approximately 4 a.m, reporting that he had taken Sharon outside as punishment and that she had subsequently disappeared, was the first element of this deception. An account designed to explain Sharon's absence in the household in terms that attributed it to an external event, a disappearance, rather than to whatever had happened inside the home. The account was, as noted, immediately suspicious to investigators, both because of its intrinsic implausibility. The idea that a 3-year-old child had simply wandered away from a residential street in the middle of the night without leaving any trace, and because of the specific details Matthews provided, which were inconsistent in ways that experienced investigators recognized as indicators of fabricated narrative rather than a genuine account of observed events.